and welcome to another baffling, buffoonery-filled episode of What Happened, the show that tests your brittle faith in the video game industry, makes you ponder the meaning of existence, and constantly has you begging for the answer to the eternal question, Sonic 06. What?
Yes.
Who? Why? What? Okay, not so fast there, hedgehogs. To properly tell the tale of one of the biggest failures in electronic entertainment, you, dear viewers, and especially Sonic fans, should grab your crucifixes and/or Bibles. It's gonna be one bumpy ride through developmental hell. 2006 was going to be a banner year for Sega. Yeah, they didn't exactly become the big chili dog of third parties that they sought out to become back in 2001, but the industry was heading into the HD era, so there was a chance to start fresh. Part of this new plan was to make a high-definition, sexy, slick-looking, sensual Sonic the Sex Hog title that would also culminate with the Blue Blur's 15th anniversary. It would also be the launch game for the assuredly successful PlayStation 3 and be a moneymaker for the Xbox 360, which was starting to hit its sales stride at that point. Oh, what's this? Nintendo's making a new console too? Shit, well we gotta have Sonic on that. It was like Sega had a t-shirt launching bazooka, but instead of clothing, it was just crammed with Sonic's twisted, broken body, which was then just shot out in all directions, and Sega figured they'd hit their target eventually. The game would go on to be simply dubbed Sonic the Hedgehog, and was meant to be the new starting point for the franchise, spearheaded by impressive visuals wowing pretty much everyone who laid eyes on it. But behind closed doors at Sonic Team, things they weren't going well. Through various, mostly hilarious reasons, the Wii version of Sonic 2006 hit a few, shall we say, snags. And by snags, I mean it was cancelled. The development team were split in twain, Sonic's father walked away from Sega, and the release date of the game, for even more hilarious reasons, could not budge. It had to come out by the end of 2006, and when it did, it left a permanent poop stain on the Hedgehog's chest, a legacy that from that point onward could never really be scrubbed off.
Sonic was never good.
So, what happened? To fully unravel the enormity of Sega's failure to kick off a new generation on the right foot, let's take a light speed dash backwards to the raunchy, filthy, morally corrupt year of 2004. Shun Nakamura, the director of such Sega titles as Samba de Amigo and Billy Who and the Giant Wah, received word from his bosses at Sega that they were fast-tracking a big Sonic reboot to coincide with the 15th anniversary of the franchise that was also set to debut on the new generation of consoles. He was to take up the task of senior game designer on the project. Directing duties would fall to one Yojiro Ogawa, while the producer role would be filled by Yuji Naka, one of the original masterminds behind Sonic. One final team member was also added to the staff, and that was Yoshinari Amake, who had spent most of his 2004 working on a prototype for a quote-unquote realistic game that would use the Havok physics engine, until Sega just canceled the whole thing outright. He was then moved on to Sonic's big 15th birthday barfarama during the planning stages when they were still trying to suss out exactly what it was going to be. With the graphical power of next-gen systems available to them, the team decided on the idea of placing Sonic in a more detailed and grounded world, to which Amake suggested they use the prototype of the game he had been working on as a base, with the player being able to interact with a lot of physics-based objects. This was not a good idea. While full-time development didn't kick off until early 2005, it wasn't long before Sega demanded some sort of demo be put together to show the press at E3 of that year. Since this was the first HD game the team had worked on, paired with the complexity of using the Havok physics engine, they only had time to squeeze out a non-playable presentation which showed Sonic moving across a grassy landscape and enter some temple ruins. While it was merely showing off the tone and scale of what they were going for, most game journalists were excited by what they saw. Now, once E3 was over and the team returned to working on the game in full, things began to get terrible. The problem with tech demos is that they're usually made to just express what the team hopes to achieve and not strictly what's possible. And in this case, almost everything turned out to be very much impossible. Since Sega is a Japanese company, emphasis was put on prioritizing the PlayStation 3 version of Sonic the Hedgehog since, the Xbox brand was always kinda considered the biggest laughingstock of the century to Japanese fans. The 360 version would be a port, with the Wii iteration also seeing the same treatment, that is until Sega finally received the specs for the machine from Nintendo. Very sharpish, Ogawa could see that the Wii version would require crap loads more work to port over, and decided to split the main team into two groups. One would work exclusively on the Wii, while the remaining staff would continue on the PS3. Even more quickly, Ogawa realized even that wouldn't be possible, and told Sega porting down to the Wii specs wasn't really a thing, and they would need to make a whole new game from the ground up, and that he would direct that title personally. This game would go on to be Sonic and the Secret Rings, or at that time be known under the much cooler moniker of Sonic Wildfire. Ogawa's next step was to move even more staff over to Secret Wildfire Rings and got to work, leaving the HD Sonic without a director. Shun Nakamura was then thrust into the position with little notice, and having only worked in that role on much smaller games, simply wasn't prepared for the Herculean task ahead of him. He had to pick up the pieces from Ogawa, but his team had been gutted, and in the most Sega-like behavior ever, Sega didn't add any additional talent to bolster their ranks, so they would need to soldier on with whoever they had left. Later that year, in October of 2005, the company would publicly announce that Sonic the Hedgehog would see release the next year for the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 and would be returned to form for the mascot. Development, however, was still going slow, and Nakamura could see that they would need to drastically start cutting back on the game's scale and what was outlined during its planning phase. In earlier leaked gameplay demos, there was going to be a dynamic day and night cycle, and a much more fleshed out hub world for Sonic to explore, not just the depressing gulag that was Soliana. Ever wonder why the objective "Go to the desert" appears early on in the game? Well, that's a holdover to where there were different hubs for Sonic to explore. Originally, there was going to be desert and snow environments, but all were eventually cut and folded into Soliana. Whew, even at this stage, problems were just piling up, but at least Nakamura could ask seasoned Sonic veteran Yuji Naka for help and guidance to, he's left the company. In March of 2006, Mr. Naka announced he was leaving his position within Sega to form his own company, Probe, stating that Sega had stuck him in a managerial role he had become unhappy with and wanted just to get back to creating and developing himself. This departure had been rumored for months, and while it was a loss for Sega, it was a much more devastating loss to Nakamura and his team, or what was left of his team, because guess what? When Yuji left, he took even more staff with him.
This is terrible!
Just who's working on this thing now? At this point, Nakamura's grabbing janitors and sitting them down at workstations. He also then decided to take the only sane option left, which was cut even more content to make that release date. While we covered some examples of gameplay-focused exclusions like the hub worlds, this also had a ripple effect across other areas of the game, such as the script and voice acting.
Have you retrieved the Book of Darkness?
Because the game's story was constantly changing to keep up with the amount of shit hitting the chopping block, some things still sort of just slipped through, like the Scepter of Darkness. This MacGuffin went through a lot of name changes up until the 11th hour, with one of those earlier ones being the Book of Darkness, which is still referenced in the final game. This is one of the biggest, but not the only reason why Sonic 2006's plot is fractured, unfocused, and generally really creepy and awkward. However, the team couldn't spend their time ironing out plot details when they had a lot more pressing matters to address, like falling out of the world and 2-minute-long load times. But in fact, they didn't have time to even address that stuff because that's all still in the game. Their main goal was to simply slap all this shit together. E3 2006 was looming, and Nakamura and the three people working under him realized they needed to make the game at least completable in time for its release date that fall. Now, up until this point, Sonic 06 had never had a hands-on demo available to the public before, and while it wasn't really ready, this was the last E3 before launch, so they had to show something. The demo consisted of a Sonic and Silver section, and for whatever reason, Silver was originally envisioned to be an orange mink named Venice, but was changed to an edgy, serious character to join the never-ending parade of edgy, serious characters the franchise had been building up.
Hey, you're not Sonic!
Reception to the demo was mixed, to say the least. Most of the emotions that rack the soul when playing the final version of Sonic 06, like depression, sadness, frustration, and revulsion, were echoed during this E3. It was still very unpolished. Sonic would get killed easily by innocently misplaced jumps, running into things, and many other hallmarks that the game instituted. Still though, it was a product in development. It was of course pre-alpha, so a lot of early previews stated that it would undoubtedly see a bevy of improvements. And it did, but not really. The next major blip on Sonic's treaded, corpse-laden path to release was September 27th at Microsoft's X06 event, which presented a brand new build of Sonic that featured many improvements to the core gameplay. Although, in a twist that could only happen to Sonic, these improvements were never actually implemented into the main game. See, sometime in early 2006, Sega upper management had struck a deal with Microsoft to promote the game as a more Xbox 360 focused title, putting most of their marketing muscle behind that version in the West, while the PS3 would be the dominant one in Japan. Due to this, the demo of Sonic at Microsoft's event had a few extra levels of polish that the Xbox 360 porting team had time to get out the door. The camera received a lot of tweaks and was more dynamic. Sonic's run animations off boost pads were not as stiff and robotic. His homing attack had a nice forward arc that would maintain momentum, and of course there were numerous bug fixes when interacting with walls and pretty much every other obstacle. These were all tiny improvements, but there were so many of them that this demo is seen as the superior version of the game. However, since the main SKU from a developmental standpoint was the PS3, with the 360 version being the port, these changes were discarded once the new PS3 build was available and were never integrated back into the main developmental pipeline. This improved demo was also released publicly on the 360 marketplace, so lots of fans that went hands-on with this had no idea of all the delights that the final version would show them. This deal with Microsoft further complicated matters, as part of it seemingly was that the game had to release by the end of the year with no room for compromise. And even if that weren't the case, Sega had already mandated that it had to make Sonic's 15th anniversary anyway, so a delay was not in the cards. But why? Well, Sonic and the Secret Rings had slipped to a 2007 release date and would miss the Wii's launch, so Sega was unwilling to budge on both games missing the big stupid birthday that nobody really cared about but them. Release the games when they're good, not just to coincide with some fucking fictitious woodland animal's fake birthday. Like, what are you, crazy? Thus, on the dreaded day of November 14th, the game was released on both consoles, with the PS3 version actually winding up with an improved frame rate, but it was of little comfort to the legions of Sonic fans that had been wrapped in anticipation/dread. While the fastest thing alive had a few rough patches in his career up to that point, the glove finger could always be pointed at those titles being weird spin-offs developed by Western teams or any other excuses one could make, but no one could excuse this. The game would then get slammed from pretty much every publication in existence, except for one, of course. 06 was criticized for its incredibly lengthy, numerous load times, poor optimization, buggy gameplay, confusing story, huge reliance on non-interactive cutscenes.
How long is this gonna go on?
And a distinct lack of anything really next-gen about how it played. This was supposed to be Sonic's splashy comeback into a new generation and a big anniversary event of the franchise's longevity, but it wound up simply being a standard bearer for why Sega could never really get the Hedgehog's games working as well in 3D as many of his contemporaries did. Knowing all of this, we can at least see the massive amount of reasons as to why the game failed so spectacularly. Unrealistic demands by Sega, the departure of Yuji Naka, unfamiliar hardware and technology, and of course, the split splitting of the teams irreversibly destroying any chances it had to be a quality product. What's more, Sonic and the Secret Rings, while trying a number of different things, wasn't left without its own blemishes and naysayers. Frustrating controls and design made it fairly divisive, but it wasn't something that couldn't have been fixed by both teams getting the proper manpower and time to deliver on their promises. Sega was/is said to be mortified by the failure to this day, a sentiment shared by the actual team members, with Nakamura simply stating, "Development on next-generation machines proved to be very difficult for us, with many things we didn't understand. Comprehending the variety of new technologies, the new hardware, handling the enormous amount of information, these were all aspects that far surpassed both my expectations and experience." Upon its launch and critical drubbing, Sega also cancelled plans for a proposed Windows version of the title, something that was teased in E3 brochures that threatened the game would curse PCs sometime after the launch of the console iterations. Sega even doubled down on this in the instruction booklet for the PC version of Sonic Freeriders, the first of the racing trilogy that further cemented the Hedgehog's plummeting reputation that same year. Sega even went out of their way to delist the games on demand version of Sonic 06 in 2010 because of the perception it was still damaging the brand years later. But to be fair, this was probably one of the only smart decisions they made in regards to this whole debacle. It's also pretty clear that some of the cut concepts and ideas from 06 sped their way into the follow-up, Sonic Unleashed, including the day-night cycle, multiple hubs, and more momentum-based gameplay, until of course Sega decided to take a werehog-sized poop load all over that potential. It's been 13 years, and Sonic Team has had some definite highs and some undeniable lows since, and the major players that were at the helm have had similar seesaw-like careers. Shun Nakamura would go on to direct the charming Rhythm Thief and the Emperor's Treasure, but would also be one of the main producers behind Sonic Forces. Yujiro Okawa left the company in 2012 and seemingly hasn't returned to game development since. Yuji Naka would never find the success he had with Sega again, producing titles such as Let's Tap, Ivy the Kiwi, and Rodeo the Sky Soldier, before moving on to Square Enix in 2018 in an unknown capacity. And thus concludes the story of Sonic 2006, a game which rocked the franchise so hard it never really recovered from it, at least not fully. While certain talented fans have brought some much needed positivity back to the series, many missteps have been made since then, all of them ripe for more what happens of their own. Thanks for watching!
Great!
Hello and welcome to another episode of What Happened, a show that takes an analytical eye to games and media with absolutely divine development struggles. And when you're coming hot off the heels of a very successful video game console like the Genesis/Mega Drive, well, you better believe you'll struggle to reach those same lofty heights, even if you're named after the 6th planet from the sun. So grab your space helmets and a 4-mega expansion cart and get ready to blast off as I answer the question, what happened to the Sega Saturn? When telling the story of a console's entire lifespan, it behooves one to rewind just a little bit before that, and Sega was in a pretty weird place circa 1993. Well, the Genesis/Mega Drive, okay, I'm just saying the Genesis from now on, okay, sorry, had been a worldwide hit, and the Sega CD had been a novel diversion. Things took a, let's just say it, a very wrong turn with the 32X. The ill-fated accessory was created to take on new competition that was hitting the marketplace, specifically the fearsome Atari Jaguar. The mushroom-shaped peripheral did have a surprisingly decent launch though, selling almost 500,000 units throughout the holiday season, but that petered off quickly due to lackluster support, as only 40 games were ever released for it. It really only hurt Sega Sega in the end though, as they had to slash the cost of the device dramatically within a year to liquidate all stock before its official discontinuation, and not to mention all the loyal customers who felt shortchanged. While the order to release some type of technology to combat encroaching rivals came from Sega of Japan, it was Sega of America's responsibility to make it all happen, and while they were busy with that toilet fire, the true follow-up to the Genesis was being designed. Before and during all of this, Sony had approached Sega of America on the possibility of doing a collab on a new next-gen system only a short while after Nintendo had backed out of more or less the same concept. Sega of America leadership was hyped as hell over the possibilities, so why didn't this happen then? Well, according to former Sega USA CEO Tom Kalinske in a story on GameIndustry.biz, one of the key reasons why I left Sega is when we had the opportunity to work with Sony. Sony leadership and I had agreed we were going to do one platform, share the development cost of it, share the probable loss for a couple of years on it, but each benefit from the software we could bring to that platform. We go to Sega and the board turned it down, which I thought was the stupidest decision ever made in the history of business. And so Sega continued charting their course towards Saturn, while Sony swore to never entrust their heart to another and finally decided to go at it alone. Let's get into the tech. In terms of design philosophy, the Saturn seemed to have been built with dueling ideologies at play, trying to balance between the old and the new, but not dedicating itself 100% to either thing. Obviously, being able to handle the majority of Sega's latest 3D arcade hits was a priority, but when the Saturn was being designed throughout 1993 and into 94, 2D was still king, so Sega most likely wanted some flexibility between the two. They found that flexibility with two graphics processing units, each with their own dedicated video RAM, which had their own unique responsibilities. If this sounds really similar to how the guts of the Jaguar worked, well, that's because they are really similar. Hell, that's basically how the 32X worked. These two chips were known as VDP-1 and VDP-2, with the first usually being responsible for handling pretty much all on-screen actors and objects, sprites, polygons, all that important stuff. While it wasn't a ginormous triangle-pushing powerhouse, it could scale, move, and rotate 2D art without breaking a sweat, so it was, for lack of a better term, a pretty robust GPU. So you know how the Saturn's library is remembered for its many 2D titles with impressive sprite work? Well, this is all down to VDP-1. VDP-2 was no slouch either, but it was most often used as a background generator and was rumored to have been included into the Saturn fairly late in development, because it was probably and correctly predicted that VDP-1 couldn't do absolutely everything by itself. Of course, the idea here was that when both GPUs were used in tandem, they could produce some very nice looking visuals, but developers would need to get creative to achieve them, and that included Sega themselves. As a quick example, while the arcade version of Virtua Fighter 2 had gorgeous 3D stages, the Saturn had to approximate them by pushing around a lot of 2D assets in the background, and the same went for Last Bronx, although that saw better results. These two examples are of course pretty much best case scenarios where the changes are negligible to the point that some might not even notice them. However, this did lead to many multi-platform games having to go through some pretty serious compromises to get up and running, or even to release at all. Hell, just the amount of games I've covered on this very show that had their Saturn versions cancelled well before release, well, it's like way more than a few, which is way too much. So while it was just powerful and versatile enough to get most things working, but it often required workarounds and extra time to suss out the nuances of the architecture, which became harder and harder for publishers to justify porting to it. Of course, all of this was exacerbated by where the industry was heading in general, which unfortunately for the Saturn was directly towards 3Dville. Once Sony started touting the cutting-edge polygon pushing power of the PlayStation, and eventual details started leaking about the
Nintendo Ultra 64.
Hardware, the majority of big studios started chasing the 3D dream, which you can't really blame them for. 3D's the future, fuck you, Symphony of the Night. This was something that was completely out of Sega's hands though, but like all other consoles I've covered in the past, the problems with the Saturn weren't just relegated to a single massive mistake. Oh no, Sega made lots of their own, with arguably the biggest one being the Saturn's ill-conceived Western launch. While it's been a lot of doom and gloom so far, when the Saturn released in Japan in November of 1994, it sold around 500,000 units in just about 30 days. Virtua Fighter was incredibly popular in Japan at that time, so it absolutely was the killer app, despite the port being less than arcade perfect and with no extra features added. Sega then announced that the Western launch would be in fall of 1995, almost a whole year later, but it would do so with a far meatier library of roughly 20 games. However, and this is a big however, Hayao Nakayama, CEO of Sega at the time, was starting to get a bit antsy, as the PlayStation was very rapidly catching up to the Saturn's Japanese sales numbers, despite having enjoyed a 2-week lead. Not willing to give Sony the same opportunity to catch up in the rest of the world, he mandated that the Western launch had to be moved up almost 5 whole months, May in America and July for Europe, while the PlayStation was still scheduled for that September. Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske strongly advised against this move, as it meant launching with very little software, amongst a myriad of other logistical problems, but Nakayama remained steadfast. According to Tom's account in the book Console Wars, Sega, Nintendo, and the Battle That Defined a Generation, it was clear to him that despite being CEO of Sega of America, it wasn't a decision he was allowed to participate in. So then, at E3 1995, the very first one, Tom Kalinske took the stage after a Saturn software demonstration and literally shadow dropped the whole console, saying that the Saturn had shipped yesterday and was now available across North America at some major retailers for $399 US, which it's safe to say blindsided the entire industry. Now, while that could easily be considered a mic drop, what happened next was a mic orbital strike. That very same E3, Steve Race, Sony Computer Entertainment America's CEO, walked up to that same podium and simply said, $299, and swagged off the stage, his giant balls clattering between his legs. So yeah, the Saturn would debut first, but the PlayStation was going to be $100 cheaper, have a bigger launch lineup, and a ton more hype leading up to it, cause, you know, they didn't decide to suddenly release it on a whim. Sega of America had to do the best with the hand they were dealt, and thus the Saturn launched with 6 games: Clockwork Knight, Daytona USA, Panzer Dragoon, Pebble Beach Golf Links, Virtua Fighter, and Worldwide Soccer Sega International Victory Goal Edition. While not a terrible bunch, it wasn't the best bunch either. Daytona USA and Virtua Fighter were bare bones. Panzer Dragoon could be beaten in under 2 hours, Clockwork Knight was Clockwork Knight, and 2 sports titles that were worlds away from the NFL and NHL smash hits that typified the Genesis. This wasn't the only issue though, as moving up the Saturn's launch ruffled many the third-party feather, who found out about the Saturn's moved-up release the same time as everyone else. It also pissed off other retailers who were not given any stock in lieu of favoring the bigger chains, since they were under such a sudden and tight deadline. And when the Saturn was finally available to them, some chose to not even carry it at all. The ripple effects of this snap decision go even further than that, because so many developers were caught so unawares. Between May and the original Saturn launch month of September, only two games were released, that being Bug and Street Fighter the movie. I couldn't make this up if I tried. A steady stream of games did eventually emerge as the original September release came into view, but by that time, everyone was talking about the PlayStation. There was also another big elephant in the room, or not in the room in this case. During the Saturn's launch, well, its first year, hell, its entire life cycle really, it was missing something kind of important, namely Sega's speedy blue animal mascot, Echo the Dolphin. There wasn't a single 3D mainline Echo game ever released for it, resulting in millions of dollars in lost sales and many many unhappy fans. No, seriously though, check out my Sonic X-Treme video because that's its own absolutely bonkers thing. And while it's nice the blue blur got some representation on the Saturn with Sonic R, Sonic 3D Blast, and to a lesser extent Sonic Jam, most fans knew these games weren't the big turgid 3D Sonic experience they were hoping for, so they didn't move the needle all that much. It can't be overstated how much of a massive fumble this was on Sega's part, as Sonic had been a huge element of the Jenny's success. It was just about a year into the Saturn's global debut that Tom Kalinske, who Nakayama had hired himself to beat Nintendo in the West, started to see his power and influence suddenly diminish. In a December 2022 interview with Time Extension, he explained, "The situation did change dramatically. It went from where I was able to do whatever basically I wanted to all of a sudden I was being dictated to, and I really, at the time, didn't understand why this was occurring. We'd been so successful, so I didn't understand why all of a sudden decisions were being forced on me from Japan, even to the degree of all the stuff I've talked about before on the Saturn and where I was forced to introduce it. We didn't have enough hardware, we didn't have enough software, and then to make matters worse, we were forced to introduce it 5 months earlier than we wanted. Well, we didn't want to introduce it anyway." See, Sega of America had reportedly spoken against pushing the Saturn several times to their bosses in Japan, saying it was underpowered and that relying too heavily on arcade ports would eventually turn into a detriment, but these warnings fell upon deaf ears. So in June of 1996, Tom stepped down from his position as the CEO of Sega of America along with co-chairman David Rosen, with Sega then bringing in Bernie Stolar, who they had just lured away from Sony as their new executive vice president in charge of product development and third-party relations. During this process, Sega of America's autonomy was also greatly reduced. Projects like Eternal Champions 3 were cancelled, and they would no longer be able to greenlight any games without approval from Japan, which of course would result in less games being published overall. So, for those keeping track, it was only 1 year and some change into the Saturn's Western launch, and Sega of America's upper management had already seen 2 high-profile exits, which should give you an idea of how things were going, and unfortunately, where they were headed. During his tenure at Sony, Bernie Stolar was known for electing against bringing over a number of Japanese titles, a tradition which he proudly continued over at Sega. According to some lists, and this might not be 100% accurate, all told there's 1,046 games released for the Saturn over its lifetime, with 785 of those, which is just shy of 75%, having never been brought outside of Japan. Now of course a fair number of these probably wouldn't have done that well outside of the country, but that's still a staggering amount of content left unlocalized. And you thought Reggie's tenure during the Wii era was rough. Now, I know I've been focusing a lot on how badly the Saturn was faring in the West, so it's only fair to mention that in its native Japan, it never struggled. Oh no, it actually thrived. Arcades remained popular in Japan all throughout the mid to late 90s, in contrast to the stark drop-off they saw in the rest of the world, so the Saturn saw the benefits of quick arcade conversions, along with many quality JRPGs, or actually just RPGs in this case. So it should be no surprise where the Saturn moved the bulk of its 9 million worldwide tally, selling almost 6 million of those consoles in Japan, which beat the likes of the N64, GameCube, Wii U, Xbox 360, and damn, even the Mega Drive and Dreamcast. The Saturn's catalog of games also had its own unique appeal, especially to those who weren't really into the first few years of clunky 3D that the PlayStation and N64 hosted. Dragon Force, Astal, Legend of Oasis, Guardian Heroes, and some incredibly accurate Capcom fighting game conversions with the use of the 4 meg expansion cart, which produced better visuals and animation than their PlayStation counterparts. But as nice as those small W's were, the problem was that magazines and just playground word of mouth weren't really a-buzzin' about Dragon Force or Guardian Heroes. They were gabbing about GoldenEye, Final Fantasy VII, and Metal Gear Solid. While Virtua Fighter 2 would top the Saturn charts in Japan with over 1.7 million copies sold, Sega would sadly never manage to secure that killer app it so desperately needed outside outside of Japan. Even a price drop to $199 didn't help matters much, and by 1997, there were signs that Sega themselves were already giving up on the Saturn, at least in the West. Bernie Stoller himself was not a fan of the console, claiming it was poorly designed and even going so far as to say at E3 1997 that the Saturn was not their future. I mean, hey, it's great to acknowledge when things aren't going so hot, but just like saying that raw and in public, like who let this man cook? 1997 also marked another major turn of events: Sega and Bandai's failed attempt at a fusion dance. Since both companies were starting to fall upon hard times, they felt combining their resources and brands would net them never before seen profits. This obviously did not happen because at the 11th hour, it came to light that many staffers in middle management had been strongly against the merger, and the opposition then grew so fast and so loud that Bandai just pulled out. This failure then caused their CEO/nepotism baby, who inherited the company from his dad, Makoto Yamashina, to quit altogether, taking most of the responsibility for the merger collapsing. In a post-failed merger statement, Sega's CEO Nakayama said, "We will not be successful working together if Bandai's management cannot take a hold of people's hearts." Damn, that's some real ass shit right there. But then Nakayama also stepped down from his position as CEO, mainly due to his part in the failed merger, all his recent really bad decisions, and finally the really terrible 1997 that Sega had, so he was out the door by January of 1998. While not every merger throughout history has been an unmitigated success, it's easy to see how access to way more staff and Bandai licensed brands could have really benefited Sega in the long run. As we move into 1998 though, we move into an incredibly tough time if you were a Saturn fan living outside of Japan. During the entirety of that 12-month period, there were only 7 new Saturn games released. 7! Granted, they weren't really anything to scoff at: Burning Rangers, Winter Heat, The House of the Dead, Magic Knight Ray Earth, Shining Force 3, NHL 98, and Panzer Dragoon Saga. But can you imagine your platform of choice getting barely more than a half dozen games per year? Well, I guess Wii U owners could.
Hey y'all, Scott here.
Obviously, this reduction in releases was mostly down to Sega diverting their teams onto the Dreamcast, which I've covered before, but this meant that from November of 1998 to September of 1999, Sega released no games for any console in North America, which most likely caused a decent chunk of fans to seek their gaming fix elsewhere. Meanwhile, in Japan, the Saturn continued on its merry way for 2 more years, seeing support from Sega until its final release in March of 2000, which actually hurts my head a little bit. When I think of the Saturn, I imagine it just vanishing off the face of the earth the second the Dreamcast was announced, which goes to show just how different the situation was in its home country. I think, when looking back on the complicated relationship between Sega of America and their home branch, it's clear there was a lot of finger pointing, but after going through all the facts, I can't help but feel that the US branch got the short end of the stick here. This was a really tumultuous time for the industry in general, with several other high-profile consoles failing to gain much traction. But fortunately for the Saturn, it's the most successful of that bunch, and easily the most fondly remembered. Nowadays, the console and its back catalog is highly desirable amongst collectors, as it's teeming with underrated gems worth seeking out, especially the ones that never left Japan, like my precious Final Fight Revenge. If you know of any other games, consoles, or whatever that absolutely went through it, let me know in the comments below or give me a shout over on my Twitter. See you next time, and thanks for watching! Hey honey, wake up! There's a new What Happened about a Sonic game! Again! Hello and welcome to the video series you just clicked on because you saw this mischievous blue ball of childhood nostalgia, youthful attitude, frustration, and untapped potential in the thumbnail. And speaking of which, nothing says wasted potential more than Sonic the Hedgehog's short-lived, almost non-existent career on the Saturn. If you've ever wondered why the Blue Blur never had a mainline entry on Sega's beguiled 32-bit machine, well, oh boy, do I have an episode for you. While I had assumed 06 or Boom were dead-ass the worst examples of Sonic's troubled developmental history, it turned out that neither can compare to the sloppy hot mess that was Sonic X-Treme. So, what happened? The two-tastic rodent was... wait, is he a rodent? Erinacida? I ain't saying that. The rodent was what moved Genesises and/or Mega Drives to millions of homes across the globe, so obviously Sega was keen to continue that success. Starting with Sonic 2, however, development on Hedgehog-focused titles happened within the tension-filled walls of California's Sega Technical Institute, which was founded by Mark Cerny, best known as the mastermind behind the internet meme, Knack. Now, even though Sonic 2 is the best Sonic, and no, I won't be taking questions, the development of that game didn't go flawlessly, as it was co-developed by both Sega of America and Japan. There was a significant amount of disagreement and miscommunication between both sides, but hey, at the end of the day, they wound up making Sonic 2. This trend continued with Sonic 3 and Knuckles, albeit a bit smoother, but after that, the Hedgehog's video game career started to divert slightly, and when I say divert, I mean go straight off the map. Development on a follow-up started immediately after Knuckles shipped, and for lack of a better term, let's just call the game in this early phase Sonic the Hedgehog 4, but not that 4. Oh god, I'm gonna have to talk about that one too. Sega of America was put into the driver's seat at the outset, as Yuji Naka and most of the original Sonic team started working on Knights for the Saturn instead. Therefore, Sega of America was delegated to supporting the Genesis way past its prime, so this was meant to be the last big swan song for the console. And since they had already cut their teeth on several 2D Sonic games by that point, the thought here was that they'd be able to bust out one more relatively quickly, and to max out the Genesis while doing it. Unfortunately, a red flag was raised to about half-mast when it came to the story. Sonic 4's original plot was to center around the Boobowskis, a daughter-father duo who were charged with keeping the 6 magical rings of order safe. For reasons, I guess. Robotnik wanted these rings for other reasons, so Tiara and Gazebo tasked Sonic with saving the day. As you can imagine, this idea was scrapped quicker than a whippet with a bum full of Sonic. The plot and setting then changed to center around Robotnik's newest Death Egg, a Death Egg so big that not even he himself could eat it. I mean, so big that it dwarfed Sonic's planet, Mobius. Yes, Mobius. The team had decided to adapt the then-current Saturday morning cartoon show, which would have squeezed in the Freedom Fighters, Sally No Pants Acorn included. During all of this, word came down from on high that there was going to be a sudden change in the machine they were targeting. Get used to this now. STI were ordered to abandon the Genesis altogether and to move everything over to the 32X, which was gonna need all the help it could get. Work on this version of the game did not last long, since the 32X burned so brightly and yet so briefly. Well, it didn't actually burn brightly, but Sega abandoned the tumor-shaped add-on after only 6 months on the market, you see, so they felt that releasing a new exclusive mainline Sonic on it would have been a waste of resources. That meant there was only one machine or planet left to develop for, and that of course would be the Saturn. Now, while you may think that having your project bumped up to your company's newest, most high-spec platform was a good thing, well, you'd be wrong. Very few members of STI had any experience with 3D hardware or programming, and this was going to be their first non-16-bit game. It's unclear if Sonic, whatever it was called at this point, had a flirtation with staying 2D on the Saturn, but if it did, it was probably short-lived. With the launch of the Nintendo 64 coming in about a year, the sneak peeks of Mario, and the smash success that the PlayStation was already seeing, Sega decided Sonic needed to burst into the third dimension to compete, even if no one on the actual development team knew how to do such a thing. How much time would Sega give to STI to accomplish this then? Holiday season 1996 is the official answer, but the real answer is not enough. While part of the plan was to hopefully steal some thunder from these guys, the holiday mandate wasn't just about that though, as it was also about a key marketing decision. Marketing for what? The live-action movie you never even knew existed. Sega had cut a preliminary deal with MGM Studios, and the game was going to link up to this film, so it had to come out in late 1996, hell or high water. You out there watching this right now, grip the sides of your monitor, TV, or phone, hold it tight, and just lick it. This is 100% grade A Kobe beef what happened material here, folks. Now, as I alluded to before, Sega of America were very late to the Saturn game, as their job was to support the Genesis and add-ons until their dying breath. So when STI got the order to move to the Saturn, Sega of America didn't have any dev kits or even specs for the machine. That's just how frosty the relationship between both sides of Sega really was, and not just when it came to Sonic. If you want to find out how this affected fighting games within the company, check out this Flophouse Files right here. When STI did finally get the dev kits, they knew they were gonna go through it. Creating a 3D game with little experience and even less time was going to be a Herculean task, so they decided to branch off into two main groups. One focused on creating 3D boss encounters that would give Sonic a lot of free movement and would be achieved through the Saturn's raw polygon pushing power. They had very few tools or an engine to work off of, so this had to be done from scratch, and therefore was mostly trial and error. The other team started putting together the main zones leading to said boss encounters, but did so through Windows PC development tools, because otherwise they would have to share the dev kit afforded to them from Sega of Japan, which would have meant even slower progress. The idea was that they would develop on PC and then port down to Saturn specs when they had finalized work. Also, it's been reported that during this phase of development, Yuji Naka paid a visit to STI to see how things were going, and once he saw how said things were going, he simply said, "Good luck." Disagreements between Sega of Japan and America began to get more and more frequent, leading to arguments between design and programming, and this is a chief reason why the game was making such slow progress at this critical point. The critical point in question was late 95, early 96, and already the Saturn wasn't seeing the momentum enjoyed by its competitors, so the stakes grew increasingly higher. The project, now dubbed Sonic X-Treme, found itself in the middle of a war between two sides, with neither able to agree on a consistent direction. This resulted in the game's team lead, Michael Kosaka, leaving the company altogether, and Chris Sen, a relative newcomer, was then put in his place. This was not an enviable position, mind you, especially for someone with little leadership experience, and to top it all off, as we've seen, Chris was inheriting a mess. Producer for the project, Mike Wallace, in an interview a few years ago, revealed that the internal politics heavily affected the game and stifled things from just about every angle. We had artists doing art for levels that hadn't been concepted out. We had programmers waiting and waiting and waiting until every minute detail had been concepted out. And we had designers doing whatever the hell they wanted. It was a mess, and because of the internal politics, the art director had trained his art team to hate the designers and programmers. It was even more difficult to get any work done. During this extremely disorganized phase of the project, multiple game designs were still being considered. At one point, it was going to feature 4 playable characters with distinct gameplay styles, with Sonic having to navigate levels with the fisheye lens perspective many of you have probably seen and thrown up to while watching.
Things are about to get bulbous.
Since they were really running out of time though, it was decided that they should just focus on Sonic and his new gameplay style. Points for originality, but personally I always thought this looked like a quick insert or a graphical effect for a 90s as shit Sonic commercial and not like a full-fledged title. Imagine playing a game through a telescope or a door's peephole for minutes or hours at a time. I mean, I guess that's extreme? Mr. Miles Prower was going to have first-person flight mode gameplay, while Knuckles would indulge in top-down sections during which I'm sure he would never utter a chuckle. Now I did say 4 characters, didn't I? Well, both Amy and Tiara Bubarella, or whatever her name was, well, they were briefly considered, and if this plan had gone through, they would have jumped and or bopped through traditional side-scrolling levels. Speaking of those levels, the Windows-based programming method that they had been built under proved to be kind of disastrous. Try to sound shocked. When they attempted to port their work over to the underpowered Saturn, it was so headache-inducing and such a time sink that the team contracted an outside party, Point of View, to do that work for them. Otherwise, they'd never get anything done. Adding a third team into the mix who were off-site in these almost non-existent days of online communication just added to the chaos. Or chaotics. I tried. Look, I'm trying to add some levity here, people. Things kept spiraling. Point of View started making their own unique builds and stopped taking direction, which resulted in clashes between all 3 teams, with some employees even going like Maverick and shit. And that was the perfect time for another visit from Sega of Japan higher-ups. And as you should be used to it by now, this only made things worse. One look at what had been done, and they were ordered to scrap almost everything and to rebuild using the 3D boss encounter engine as a base. All that Windows development work for the main zones was completely thrown out. Now, thankfully, since they were told to start over and scrap a bunch of work, Sega of Japan then pushed the game's release date back by around 6 months. Which is something I would be saying to you if this wasn't mid-90s Sega. The movie was still in the cards, you see, and the Saturn was still lacking a big holiday title, so the release date stayed the same. Get crackin', fellas! The team at STI crunched for months leading up to release, with Michael Wallace detailing just how committed the team was to making that date, saying that an employee actually left their apartment, canceling their lease, moved all their belongings into the office, and worked day and night. Sega of America president Bernie Stoller knew X-Treme was going poorly and that the team were being pushed to their limits, so he asked them straight up what could he do to directly help the project. Mike Wallace said that getting the engine and tools from Sonic Team's Knights, which they had seen an early version of months prior, would be a godsend, and Bernie Stoller delivered. The team started experimenting, but it was only 2 weeks later when Bernie came back and said they had to immediately stop. This was at the behest of Yuji Naka, who threatened to leave Sega if the engine continued to be used. Chris Sen revealed his thoughts on this in an interview with Retro Gamer. Personally, I can understand Naka's interest in keeping technology his team developed under tight control. Sonic was a franchise he clearly felt should be handled solely by Sonic Team. He must have felt very strongly about it if he was willing to threaten to quit. I mean, sure, if he was willing to sabotage Sonic's Saturn debut in a bid to make sure his team would remain at the top of the hill, yeah, I would call that pretty strongly. While that was certainly devastating to the project's chances, all this stress wound up hurting much more than Sega's bottom line. Roughly 2 months before the deadline, both Christina Coffin and Chris Sen came down with sudden illnesses. Coffin developed a bad bout of pneumonia, which took them out for weeks, whereas Sen had contracted an unspecified illness and was given 6 months to live, but thankfully recovered afterwards. These were people they really couldn't replace. Chris Sen was the game's director, and Coffin was the one responsible for the 3D boss encounter engine. And so, it's with these final 2 setbacks that Sega finally came to their senses. With X-Treme getting cancelled, Sega then quickly attempted to get some type of product out to make up for it. Traveler's Tales Sonic 3D Blast got a quick and dirty port onto the Saturn and was immediately slotted into that holiday 1996 date. They were also contracted to throw together Sonic R the very next year, and stuck to a basic racing design to help get it out the door ASAP. It should be noted that it was actually Sega of Europe that coordinated these projects between Traveler's Tales and Sonic Team, and aside from distribution, Sega of America was cut out completely for reasons I don't think I need to go into. The failure of Sonic X-Treme didn't just disband the team, it essentially killed Sega of America in terms of being an active developer. Chris Sen would move on to Luxoflux and the True Crime series, and eventually even wound up back at Sega to work on Sonic Boom. Christina Coffin bounced between several big studios, working on Far Cry, Assassin's Creed, and finally Battlefield. As for Mike Wallace, well, he would also see a successful career working on franchises like Tomb Raider, Army of Two, and most importantly, Get Onto Mike. But wait, you ask, what about that Sonic movie? Well, the plan was for Sonic X-Treme to have a cliffhanger ending, which would lead into the events of the film, which was going to be called Sonic the Hedgehog and the Wonders of the World. Rolls right off the tongue. When it was clear that the game wasn't going to make the end of 1996, the movie met a fate more horrible than death. The desire for a big mainline Sonic title to save the Saturn was essentially abandoned here, and Sega had to set its sights on the future. While in our heads 9999 was when the Dreamcast was released, that wasn't so in Japan. The console made its debut at the end of '98 in its home country, and so did Sonic Adventure, which means that it was made fairly quickly. While STI were struggling in mid-1996, Sonic Team had just finished Knights and had already begun development on Sonic Adventure, so it only took them 2 short years to make the Dreamcast's Japanese debut, give or take a month. Boy, all that 3D experience and tools you guys had sure would have helped out the other teams, huh? Alright, let me be clear. A lot of this could have been avoided, like almost all of it. While there was pressure to deliver a big 3D game that would wow new fans, the first version of Sonic X-Treme the team had started on, the 2D side-scroller, was definitely the safer bet. If STI had been able to incorporate everything they had learned with 2D, but maybe leave Tiara Tidikowski out of it, and then put that game on the Saturn, we could have gotten the ultimate 2D Sonic game back in '96. It could have had insane sprite scaling, rotation, color, and maybe even some basic 3D polygonal elements for special stages. Just, it was right there, right in front of them. But, as we know, 2020 vision always seems to do its best work when it's in hindsight. Fans have since tried to resurrect or keep interest in Sonic X-Treme alive because of course they would. Back in 2015, an early build of it was released to the public. It was incredibly basic, not very good, but nevertheless fascinating. It has to be the most infamous lost/cancelled Sonic anything that there's ever been. We'll leave on Chris Sen summing things up about this tumultuous time in his career. It was about as bad as I've seen, the politics that led to Kosaka-san's departure, allowing a newbie wannabe designer like me to fill a veteran like Michael Kosaka's shoes without guidance and direction, going through 3 lead programmers in the first year and a half of production, each time restarting the technology. A divide between people's ideas about what the game should be, egos, inexperience, poor communication, bad politics, all of these things contributed to the inevitable demise of the project. That was rough. In recent years, some fans have theorized that Sonic Lost World took some inspiration from X-Treme and some elements of its design that, wow, the Sonic Lost World! I had completely wiped that from my memory. And wait, what? There was Zelda DLC in that? If you know of any other canceled games, Sonic related, Sega related, oh wait, there was Yoshi DLC too? Then let me know in the comments below, over on my Twitter, or speed on over to the green hills of the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss and nominate what you'd like to see in the future. See you next time, and thanks for watching.
It's spherical! Spherical!
Welcome to another mind-shredding, teeth-grinding, butthole-clenching episode of What Happened, the show where we regularly discuss and dissect, among other things, video game publishers that maybe don't do the best job utilizing their legacy IPs. So yeah, today we'll be plunging deep into one of the many series that have long since been abandoned by the Sonic and Yakuza company. A series that went through an identity crisis during its apex, only for it to die a spectacular flashy death during the swinging 1920s era of video games known as the late 2000s. Golden Axe Beast Rider is a juicy, prime-cut slice of beefy what happened goodness that has all the delectable aromas we've come to know and love. Overambitious design, a bumbling publisher, crunch, delays, cancellations, inexperience, closures? This story's got it, even if you don't really want it. So, let's all start where the troubles began. 1995. Despite releasing the incredible sequel Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder to arcades, Sega ignored it completely and released the kind of tired retread Golden Axe 3. While that was being gingerly digested by fans of the series, they then followed up with Golden Axe: The Duel, a fighting game spin-off that very few people remember, let alone played. And then after that, nothing happened. 2004, Sega of America hires one Simon Jeffrey, formerly of LucasArts, as their new CEO to hopefully bring in sweeping changes into their business model since they were hot off the heels of leaving the hardware business. The company as a whole wanted to make more headway into Western markets, and Simon was their key hire to try to accomplish that. One part of this strategy was to actually leverage their huge back catalog of unused franchises and characters, and to reboot them for modern audiences, as was the style at the time. Enter Secret Level, a San Francisco-based studio which had very few projects of substance to their name, as their work amounted exclusively to various ports. Now, 2 of these ports bear special mentioning. The Xbox version of Final Fight Streetwise was handled by Secret Level and is a far worse version of the PS2 original, which is fucked up to say. The other port was Star Wars Jedi Starfighter, which, while not notable on its own, leads us to our next point. Secret Level worked with Simon Jeffrey while he was at LucasArts. So, knowing he had been hired by Sega and knowing they were looking to reboot their old franchises, Secret Level made their pitch for a new entry into the barbaric world of Golden Axe, and that about concludes the so far so good portion of the story.
Bloody shit.
A bit of context here, Secret Level had never made a game from scratch, but were itching to do so, because while they lacked a lot of experienced designers and programmers, they made up for it with a technology base, having worked on all those aforementioned ports. They were putting together their own custom engine, which theoretically would be able to render expansive landscapes, perfect for open-world game design. This worked out because their pitch for Golden Axe was going to be a sandbox experience that would see multiple players battling the forces of Death Adder whilst riding dozens of different beasts, hence the name. Multi-tiered quests, collectibles, and lots of locations to explore, all the stuff you'd expect from an open-world game at the time, and Sega just ate it up. This was because their big Western push was inspired by GTA's exploding popularity, and Secret Level's ideas were exactly what they wanted to hear. So, with Sega of America's enthusiastic approval, the team set to work, but there was only one small problem. Their engine wasn't even close to being ready for the monumental tasks it had ahead of it. The studio was then due to present Sega their first full engine test in late 2005, displaying what the game would be technically capable of. Now, while this was an isolated, bare-bones presentation, Sega was satisfied with what they saw, but what they didn't see was that Secret Level's designers and artists were already falling behind, struggling to design and build, since the progress on the engine and its tools happened to be the most dangerous combination, both slow and ambitious. One of these progression blockers was an internal argument about multiplayer, something they had pitched to Sega, but many were unsure if it was going to be technically possible. Much time was spent debating on the feature's inclusion, but at that particular moment, Secret Level higher-ups felt it was better to first design a single character, and once that was fleshed out, they'd get back to that multiplayer. The issue here, of course, was that that singular character took longer than expected. The engine work was still lagging behind, as programmers didn't know exactly what they had to program for because the designers still didn't know what the engine would/wouldn't be able to achieve. This is one of the chief problems of Beast Rider, as you can see. Since the team had never worked on an all-original project together, they hadn't yet gelled, and worse still, they had already dripped honey into Sega's ears, promising an ambitious game that would surely put Golden Axe back on the map, so the pressure was already mounting.
They are already in the higher level, so probably I don't need to say anything to them.
Now, that one character they were working on just happened to be Tyrus Flare, the Amazonian-like warrior featured in the previous games, complete with a new look. And while they were designing this character, and despite all the other issues cropping up so very early, Secret Level were already due to show a new main build of the game in spring of 2006.
Great lord.
Behind you, girl!
And again, this build wound up being far more limited than what it should have been. Strangely though, Sega either still really liked what they saw, or at least figured there was some latent potential in it, because even Secret Level art director Christopher Bretz acknowledges this playable demo was going to be anything but. It wasn't ready to be shown, but it was going to look good. It was going to be technically fine, but you were going to be able to play it. Now here's where things just get kinda weird. Shortly after this demo was presented, Sega decided to invest $15 million into Secret Level, most likely at the behest of Simon Jeffrey. This move came as a bit of a shock, especially to Sega themselves, as some other executives at the company felt it was a bit odd.
This feels excessive!
Considering Secret Level hadn't even delivered a game yet, and what they had shown was obviously dragging its little monster feet, to put it nicely. Sega of America Chief of Technology Jez Sherlock was especially incredulous at the acquisition. A number of people like myself were always a little baffled by it. I've always believed that it was to secure the team and to make sure they're around to complete Golden Axe, and beyond that, it was a long-term play, I guess. There is one other reason as to maybe why Sega decided to inject so much cash so suddenly into Secret Level. They just needed more bodies to throw at projects. In 2007, Sega signed a deal with Marvel Studios to bring their burgeoning cinematic universe to game consoles, starting first with Iron Man, which was set to Proton Blast theaters the following year. And against all laws of sense and good business, Sega assigned Secret Level to this project, in addition to Beast Rider, whose development would need to slow down, way down. This is because the deal they had signed with Marvel mandated that the games needed to be out in stores by the time the movie launched. Absolutely no exceptions. Thus, Secret Level split into Iron Man and Beast Rider teams, with the thought that each project would be able to help the other. Workarounds and tech used to power Iron Man could be used to solve problems in Beast Rider and vice versa. Now, despite that silver lining, both teams wound up suffering due to lackluster tools and the shaky engine they both now shared. And since Iron Man had an immovable release date, it was even harder and more stressful to build.
Honestly, it's impossible.
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave! With a box of scraps!
So, with a much more diminished team, Secret Level had to drastically cut back on Golden Axe's scope and features, and chief among these was the entire open world design. The quests, the dozens of rideable monsters, and the multiple playable characters had to either be scaled back or cut altogether. Almost nothing remained from the original design pitch that the studio had drafted up almost 4 years earlier.
I've lost everything.
I'd say about 15% of the total effort made it into the final game. The other 85% was the other iterations, whole other kinds of versions of the game code that never saw the light of day, said producer Michael Bossieri. This was also the time where any illusions of actual multiplayer also died, and more specifically, online multiplayer. You see, Secret Level had zero experience with network functionality, and thus tapped a third party to provide an online solution for them. That third party, which has since remained unnamed, was then acquired by a bigger company, and thus the deal they had in place for Golden Axe was dissolved. Secret Level now had to focus on just one character to ship this thing, and while Tyrus was always in the previous builds, it all came down to a marketing decision about who should appear on that final box art: Tyrus, Axe Battler, or Gilius Thunderhead.
Bloody shit.
Christopher Barretts explains, "We didn't feel the dwarf could carry the whole game, and with God of War out there, we didn't want Axe Battler to go up against Kratos, so we focused on Tyrus." Now, even with this renewed focus and not having to worry about multiple characters and the like, Secret Level still couldn't seem to catch a break. The original design for Tyrus's animations would incorporate loads of motion capture, which of course was pretty standard. However, and this is one of the biggest howevers of all time, an unnamed staffer at Secret Level was in charge of the motion capture shoot that day, and didn't see anything wrong with having the actors move in slow motion. All the data that was recorded featured these slow, deliberate movements, whereas the flow of the combat animations were all built and designed around fast, brutal swordplay and taking on multiple enemies at once. When this was realized, Secret Level's animation department tried for 2 months to make the motion capture data work for their purposes, but eventually gave up, as it was estimated it would just be faster to hand animate rather than salvage the motion capture. During all these issues, the splitting of the main team into two, the engine problems, the animation debacle, you start to detect a certain presence, a certain electricity in the air. Your spine tingles with an intoxicating mix of both excitement and dread, and that's when you look up, and that's when you see him. Many staffers at Secret Level recall an unprecedented level of crunch, which, considering all the project's problems, is sadly something to be expected. We had an executive producer put us all on schedules for the weekend, and so we'd go out to a club for a bit and then come in and sleep under our desks and continue on working into the night. We did that for 6 months. Everybody did, every weekend, 7 days a week. And it's during these long last few months that Secret Level just needed to make sure what they had was playable, rather than to polish or fix any underlying gameplay issues. Beast Rider had already been pushed back considerably from their target release date due to either technical or Iron Man related problems. To do this, they needed to hire some heavy hitters, so upper management fired several junior staff members and replaced them with experienced producers and designers to get this thing out the door. When these new hires finally sat down to work, people that had been living in the Beast Rider trenches were very transparent when it came to the state of it. See this design document, the one that's the size of a Bible? Yeah, don't bother reading it! It's all changed now. And my personal favorite quote, because it cuts straight to the heart of the matter, you're basically inheriting a mess. Now, the term cancel gets thrown around a lot these days, and it was a word mumbled within the halls of Secret Level more than once during the genesis of Golden Axe. Higher-ups within the studio knew it was never an option that they themselves could put forward. Sega had invested $15 million into the fledgling studio, so they had to keep working. Still though, the project was very nearly cancelled by the heads of Sega of Japan, as Secret Level was summoned to show off their newest build, with the game's fate hanging in the balance. This particular meeting was recounted by producer Michael Bossieri. We went to Sega of Japan about 8 months prior to the final release and had to show them our latest playable milestone, which was effectively the first level of the game. If I moved the camera the wrong way, everything would just go to shit. We sat in front of the board at Sega of Japan, showed them this, and then we left. The board decided then and there if they were going to fund the game to its conclusion or cancel the project. Sega decided to push forward for reasons known only to Sega. Speaking of pushing things out, Iron Man finally released alongside the movie in 2008, as was ordained by the heads of Sega of America and Marvel Studios. And much like almost all of the titles born of this partnership, it fared about as well as you'd think, since they all had very short turnaround times to make those movie release dates. Maybe one day I'll make a XL-sized episode detailing what a monumental mess that whole deal turned out to be. After months of additional crunch, it was October of 2008 where Golden Axe finally lurched into store shelves on the back of a tired, broken beast. Things weren't looking good even before this launch, as the game had already accrued a poor reputation from fans due to, that's right, its complete lack of multiplayer. Also, the critical reception didn't really improve matters much. As you might imagine, the game sold poorly as well, which was just to twist the knife even further. After being contractually obligated by Marvel to make one more Iron Man game, which unfortunately wasn't much better, and by a few narrow Metacritic points was even worse than the first one, Sega dissolved Secret Level. Oh, and by the way, at some point within this entire story, sorry, I completely spaced on this, Sega even rebranded the studio as Sega Studios San Francisco, which is all types of... I don't even know what to call that. The last 13 months were some of the most challenging crunch I've ever experienced in my over 10 years in the video game industry. The engineers, designers, VFX team, the guys who were there at the end, were doing 2 months of 7 days a week. There was a team of at least 20 to 30 core staff that were some of the most dedicated people I've ever worked with, who brought the game over the line. Despite the non-ideal circumstances, some really great friendships were forged, and a lot of respect went to the people who went through the trenches with you, said Bossieri when reflecting back on the game. Golden Axe has since been thrown far back into the dusty closet that Sega uses to house its many unused IPs, and unfortunately, there's been no indication that it will ever return, as it's pretty safe to say that with the abject failure of Beast Rider, the franchise's chances for a future installment have most likely been axed. Hey, that was a good one. If you know of any other regrettable reboots or embarrassing entries in the video game or movie industries, sound off in the comments below or ride your beast over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon to nominate the subject of your choice for a future episode. See you next time, and thanks for watching. Hey there, and welcome to another omni-eyeball-searing, face-rubbing, headache-inducing episode of What Happened, the show that was created to basically talk about Sonic the Hedgehog, and I guess by that extension, Jesus? Now you can't talk, let alone think about the term video game disasters without having reserved a good chunk of your mind palace specifically for the blue blur. I mean, there's Sonic 06, Secret Rings, the Black Knight, Sonic X-Treme, the BioWare one. Your puny brain would get overloaded by visuals of creepy blue feet and Knuckles glitches. So with that in mind, we're revving to go, speeding up in our little spinball of pent-up energy to explode into the fantastic calamity that is Sega and Big Red Button's Sonic Boom: Rise of Lyric. Our story begins in the futuristic war zone known as 2009. Two industry veterans teamed up to found Big Red Button, an up-and-coming new studio that did precisely neither of those things. Nothing was going up, and certainly no one was... never mind. Those two veterans were Bob Raffaele and Jeff Lander, who hailed from both Naughty Dog and Luxoflux respectively. Bob had been with the Nasty Dogs for 13 years, having worked as a director of art on the first 4 Crash Bandicoot, Jak and Daxter titles, as well as the first Uncharted. Jeff, on the other hand, was an experienced programmer on the True Crime series, specifically on both the West and East Coast varieties. East Coast, Beast Coast! But more importantly than all that, Mr. Lander was instrumental in blessing planet Earth with a video game adaptation of Shrek 2. With these two seasoned hands, you'd think the contracts would just be flying across their desks fast and hard, but that wasn't the case for Big Red Button. Maybe because it wasn't the best time to start up a new company, as lots of developers were actually being shut down at the time, but they went through a variety of pitches and game prototypes that never really enticed any publishers. However, one company that was always looking for cheap solutions to making video games, of course, was Sega, who were interested in rebooting Sonic with a more Western focus. Sales of the then current crop of Sonic titles, these winners, weren't exactly smash hits. In fact, they showed a decline in profits overall, and Sonic's reputation wasn't exactly soaring because of it.
Sonic was never good.
Sega felt that the entire IP needed an overhaul and thought that with Bob Raffaele's experience at establishing fresh IPs over at Misbehaving Puppy, he would be the one to give Sonic a brand new spin. See, it says spin right in the script here. That was unintentional. The working code name for this take on the franchise was Project Apollo, an attempt to not clue people in that a big Sonic reboot was in the works with a Western developer, because aside from some spin-offs and diversions, was something that had never been attempted before. If you recall, this was going to be phase 1 of Sega's big dumb plan to split the universe in twain from then on out. Sonic Boom would be the North American series, while Sonic Team would continue their, usual efforts.
What the heck is going on?
The Sonic franchise would then pass off between both brands with different studios at the helm, which was again Sega trying to crib notes from other far more successful publishers. So, Big Red Button's first step was delving deeper into the lore than ever before, explaining Sonic's origins as well as Eggman's to really kick off this whole new universe on the right foot. Sega's official edict was to radically change parts of the Sonic formula, which were moving to the right, I guess, with things like teamwork and co-op, along with placing a much greater focus on exploration and skill-based platforming. The game would be roughly divided between 80% exploration versus 20% speed, with a lot of those being vehicle-based. Big Red Button would spend more than a year fleshing out the world, storyline, and gameplay systems before eventually presenting their ideas to Sega of Japan for approval. This would be in the form of a vertical slice, a playable but brief section of a level that showed off all the main gameplay mechanics. Once approved, they'd then start building the rest of the game off of that blueprint, along with any feedback and changes from Sega, which, wouldn't you know it, would be a metric fuckton. This of course would include stuff that contradicted the other stuff that Sega wanted in the first place. That's so Sega. But we'll get to that stinky bridge when we cross it. Now, another important thing that was always changing was what this Sonic game was gonna be called, as two names in particular were being tossed around. One being Sonic Origins, since the game was exploring that, and the second was Sonic Synergy, which made sense due to all the co-op shenanigans. In fact, co-op wasn't just a throwaway mode or gimmick, but rather became one of the game's core features, as Big Red Button was pushing for 4-player functionality and an online component to boot. It all sounded pretty ambitious, but fortunately, Sega had asked Big Red Button to target next-generation systems, which obviously meant the PC, PS4, and Xbox One. In terms of engines, Sonic would use the one that, while unconventional, could boast pretty visuals well suited for the lush new world Big Red Button was designing. CryEngine 3, while not as common or familiar to most game studios, was still considered an impressive bit of tech at the time. During this phase of development, things were going smoothly, but as any stalwart What Happened fan should know, with Sega about you should never be too comfortable, lest a vat of gooey bullshit be unleashed upon your naive, unsuspecting head. Once Sega and Sonic team, then headed up by newly promoted Takeshi Iizuka, were shown the vertical slice, they started to ask for thousands of changes. They felt what Big Red Button presented was far too removed from what the franchise stood for. Despite that being the whole point of the project, the game was too slow. They were no longer sure about those character designs, and they wanted more speed sections. They also asked for the ability to swim underwater to be removed so that Sonic and friends would instantly die as soon as they touched the deadly substance known as H2O. Like in the old Sonic games. Like in the old Sonic 3D games. There were even some changes that were a bit weird. Like, initially, the character of Cliff, this thing right here, started off as an inventor, providing gadgets and the like to Sonic & Co. Like a lot of the other NPCs in the world, Sega requested some alterations, and for Cliff, it was to change his occupation as an inventor. Why? Well, this was due to an ironclad rule in the Sonic Bible which stated that only Tails and Eggman can be inventors, which I assure you I'm not making up. Finally, there was the real kicker, the storyline. What most of the game revolved around? That had to be changed too, because apparently Sonic Team wanted to try their hand at the Hedgehog's origins down the line, so they were uncomfortable with letting a Western developer tackle it first, despite this being the whole separate universe thing. Okay. So anyway, the epic tale involving Sonic and his initial friendship and eventual falling out with Eggman, all of it had to be redone. Ever wonder why in the finished version of Sonic Boom there's statues depicting ancient echidnas and hedgehogs and shit, but nobody really notices or says anything about it? That's why. All of that world building went to waste because despite some of the levels and scenery hinting at a grander tale, it was all scrapped for a thrilling narrative about Sonic beating a villain. Yo bro, them some
Fresh ideas.
So, with the origin story all thrown out, what were they gonna replace it with? Well, fortunately, Sega had just the thing.
Oh no!
They had struck another, completely separate deal with a French animation studio to produce a brand new computer-animated cartoon which would be dubbed Sonic Boom and would also be aiming at that lucrative Western market. Sega felt to keep brand continuity, Sonic Synergy would need to adopt this new world's aesthetic and tone, and obviously the name as well. Now, while all of this was surely an RKO from out of nowhere to pull on Big Red Button, it fortunately wasn't a deal breaker, as changing storyline and character art wouldn't be really devastating to the project. That's because what Sega was about to announce next would definitely be devastating to the project.
Game companies always ruin their beloved franchises.
Not long after the game shifted to Sonic Boom, Sega informed Big Red Button that it was now going to be a Wii U exclusive, and no, you can't stop this. The Wii U, one of Nintendo's biggest failures, Sega decided to enter an exclusivity deal with them, delivering 3 new Sonic games, including Boom, onto a console that didn't support CryEngine 3.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Big Red Button, as you can imagine, were in panic mode. What's more, this deal with Nintendo had a timeline. The game needed to be out in 2014, which left the studio slightly less than a year to make all this work. And it really didn't work. Okay, well obviously it did in the end, kinda. The game is playable, but what did it cost?
Everything.
So obviously, to make all of this happen, Big Red Button need to start scaling everything back and removing features.
Now, while I wasn't able to cut everyone I wanted to, I have cut a lot of you.
4-player co-op was removed. The same goes for any online features. More elaborate team-up attacks were also taken out, and whole sections of additional story and dialogue were hastily sliced from the narrative. Some of those included instances of Sonic talking to Lyric or vice versa, where they'd insinuate they were familiar with each other despite them not being actually familiar with each other.
Who are you?
Yeah. Amy congratulates a completely different cut character during an action stage.
Way to go, Percy!
Despite the fact that Knuckles is the only other guy on screen. Poor Knuckles. There was a penultimate plane level where Tails gave chase to Lyric. There was also going to be some Chow collecting functionality. There was even going to be gamepad gimmicks where you'd use the touchscreen to control platforms and oodles of other stuff. Some of that stuff was entire cut sections of the world itself, as they initially only existed to support 4-player sections like water skiing as seen in this trailer. Oh right, that's the trailer. Yeah, this is a whole other mess of bubbling hedgehog poop. Remember this? Remember how, despite it looking different than most Sonic games, it still looked pretty cool, nice and shiny, lots of animations and effects, and tons of 4-player action? Well, as long as Sega added this vague disclaimer, they could technically show you anything they wanted, even if it was running on high-end PC workstations, which, you know, it was. None of this was Wii U footage, as it couldn't be because this trailer was cut days, maybe weeks after Sega told Big Red Button to start toiling in the barren and lonely Wii U mines. So all of this, lies, some lies there. Ooh, that's a big lie right there. It almost makes you think that during the Colonial Marines debacle, that Sega learned a few magic tricks from one Randy Pitchford, king of the charlatans. Thus entered a soul-crushing, almost year-long marathon of crunch to get all of this running on this. It was a tall order, as every single thing Big Red Button had designed, animated, and optimized was all intended for machines that greatly overpowered the Wii U. Now, not only did porting down to it prove to be a massive pain in the ass due to all the cut content, it was a logistical problem in the sense that CryEngine 3 didn't support the Wii U architecture at all. There apparently were some early attempts at getting the engine up and running for a theoretical port of Crysis 3, but EA and Crytek quickly abandoned that plan once they realized that might actually result in them, supporting the Wii U. Because of this, a whole lot of basic things were a whole lot of never figured out, like how you need to allocate GPU power to stream onto the gamepad. Big Red Button had to somehow navigate through all of these issues and eventually contacted Crytek for help. They had no other test cases or finished games to tinker with to guide them, as no one had attempted what they needed to do, so it's a miracle they got it to happen at all. Obviously to very, very, very mixed results, but the game boots, and goddammit, that's something. Crytek eventually helped finagle Sonic Boom to run on a special version of the engine that no other game has used since. Now, aside from all that, a typical thing that most developers try to plan for is that when they're deep into production on a game, to start prototyping or designing a follow-up with a smaller team, like a sequel or DLC, just something. This is so that when the priority game is wrapping up, they can retain most of their staff and immediately start building the next thing when everyone's free. Unfortunately for Big Red Button, since the deadline was so tight and they needed all hands on deck, no other follow-up projects were in the pipe. Thus, in the final months leading to Sonic Boom's release, they had to let go of 50 people to cut costs, leaving less than 20 working at the studio. Sonic Boom released on November 11th, 2014, and remains one of the worst-selling games in the series. Stand corrected. Sega took the time to come flat out and declare that Sonic Boom was indeed the worst-selling Sonic game of all time. Like, what type of publisher goes out of their way to give additional information that shows how badly they fucked it up? That's so Sega. What's more is that the blame couldn't even be directly shifted onto the Wii U, as Sonic Lost World had performed far better the previous year. Now, while the game was certainly looking shaky and franchise fans had problems with all the designs, the very idea of Sonic Boom itself was muddled and confusing, especially to casual fans.
Get it? Not at all!
Was this based on the cartoon, or was the cartoon based on the game? Where does the 3DS version fit in? Wait, is this replacing the Japanese games or not? Even if development had gone smoothly, the handling of the split universe was just a really bad idea from its very inception. The poor sales aside, the critical and fan backlash to Sonic Boom was far, far worse than a slight dip in Sega's profits for that quarter. Bob Raffaele stated in an interview with Polygon in 2015, "We knew that historically Sonic games have been treated very poorly by the press, and we knew there was going to be some of that, but I was kind of taken aback by just the kind of hate that was being poured out. It was very disheartening. You know, you work your ass off for 3 years, you crunch like mad, you go through hell and back to try to make a ship date. And I've never experienced like hate mail in the past, and I'm getting people telling me I ruined their childhood. Alright, sorry about that, you know, I did the best I could." A former producer at Sega of America, one Stephen Frost, had a far more business-like view on Sonic Boom. "In focus tests, we heard all the time people were sick of speed. Sonic was too fast, they wanted to slow down. Speed was shelved because we were under the impression people didn't want it. Speed is always a Sonic thing, and we didn't focus on that." Look dude, I don't know who you got to participate in these focus tests, but are you sure you're not confusing them with no one? Regardless, he continues. "The biggest mistake in Boom was adding too many features to it. It was too much to ask for any development team. I was tasked with creating an experience that appeals to an audience which doesn't play Sonic. If I could do it again, I would remove features and speed would be the main focus from the start." Oh, okay, I guess. Solo Sonic games? I don't know how long that can last. There isn't enough variety to sustain it. The future of Sonic games needs to be co-op, as it worked really well in Sonic Boom. Community and online play, that sustains it. In general, you need to do multiplayer and add online multiplayer aspects that will sustain and keep the franchise alive. Will it though? So with that idiocy still wafting in the air, what happened to Sonic Boom? Well, the cartoon show produced over 100 episodes, but it's still unclear whether a third season will ever come out, despite the show gaining popularity with its clever writing and fourth-wall breaking humor.
Let's act out my Sonic fan fiction. I'll pick something family-friendly. No, not that one.
Sanzaru, who developed Shattered Crystal and Fire and Ice, did far better in achieving a balance between the old and the new, but then again, they didn't need to port Unreal 4 onto the goddamn 3DS, did they? They went on to several more projects, like helping out on the recent Spyro remaster. As for Big Red Button, well, after the critical and commercial failure of Rise of Lyric, they closed their doors in May of... never? Wait, no, this can't... No, wait. Big Red Button are... They're still in business today. No, I could have... Okay, whatever. They seemingly have transitioned to developing for both mobile and VR devices. Let's see. They worked on a John Wick game as well as their own IP, the Arc Slinger, which seems to have been a big success. Good on them. So with that, I think we can definitively say that the Sonic Boom experiment is indeed over, and while it was a good idea on paper, yeah, not really. It wasn't even a good idea on paper. That's stupid of me. We don't know what Sega and Sonic Team is cooking up next, but you can bet whatever it is has a great shot at being featured here at What Happened in the Future. In the meantime, shout your suggestions in the comments below or lightspeed dash on over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon to officially vote on our next topic. See you next time, and thanks for watching.
Just look at that Sonic the Hedgehog guy. Whatever happened to him? Is he still a thing?
We've covered many a game, movie, and etc. here on What Happened, but we haven't tackled anything quite like the story that we'll be discussing today. There's a distinct lack of last-minute engine switches, a meddling publisher, or a particular someone at the fulcrum point of all the troubles. Instead, we'll be talking about one of the greatest, most innovative, and most ambitious RPGs ever made that simply came out at the wrong time and at the wrong place, or console. This is the story of Panzer Dragoon Saga, a game that quite simply was too beautiful for this world. It's 1995 and Sega has just launched its first expedition into outer space, ultimately targeting the planet Saturn, which some feel was a massive mistake in retrospect. But its initial launch in 95 went reasonably well. They had flashy ports of Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA, a novel platformer in Clockwork Knight, and most importantly for this story, Panzer Dragoon. Yes, it was a rail shooter for all intents and purposes, but was the brainchild of young up-and-coming designer Yukio Futetsugi, who once had aspirations to be a filmmaker. He and the team he led, dubbed Team Andromeda, were able to squeeze a lot of impressive 3D performance out of the Saturn, as well as work in some clever effects that gave the game an unmistakable, ethereal quality. While rail shooters tend to provide basic fun, Dragoon had an elegant and even emotive tone to it with its synergistic marriage between action and music, as well as hinting at a mysterious civilization. You only ever got glimpses of this world as you flew by on Dragonback, so it definitely left a lot of things to the imagination of the player. Thankfully, Team Andromeda had a hit on their hands, and Dragoon wound up being an early showpiece for the Saturn, but like many other games where shooting was done via rails, it was all but too brief and didn't have many incentives for multiple playthroughs. Still though, Sega of Japan was pleased with the game's reception and early sales, and thus the team was set to expand, with 2 titles being greenlit and worked on at the same time. One a traditional sequel, and the other an entirely different beast altogether. Panzer Dragoon 2 Zwei featured better graphics, branching paths, customizable dragons, and even had unlockables and secrets to entice fans to replay it. The core team members were largely those that worked on the first game, but since it was a straightforward sequel, it let Futetsugi concentrate on the much bigger project, Panzer Dragoon Saga, or ASL Panzer Dragoon RPG in Japan. This might shock you given that title, but Saga was designed to be a full-blown RPG set in the Dragoon universe. A real-time 3D and fully voice-acted RPG with over an hour of cinematics on the Sega Saturn in the mid-90s. This was just about the most technically and artistically ambitious thing they could ever set out to make. I mean, for the time, I suppose making a massive open-world FPS RTS hybrid would have been a bit harder, if not impossible given the technology. This ambitious plan was because with Square's massively hyped RPG, Final Fantasy VII being massively hyped as a big exclusive for Saturn rival the PlayStation, the head of Sega, Hayao Nakayama, felt firing back with their own big RPG was going to be critical in gaining ground. So the project would need to be all the things that Final Fantasy wasn't doing, but of course with much less of a budget and with a team that had never made an RPG before. Now, while all of this was certainly a noble goal, it would lead to one of the most arduous development cycles of the 1990s. So much so that in 2018, Futetsugi was quoted as saying, "Even now, when I run into problems, I think, well, at least this isn't as hard as when we were developing Panzer Dragoon Saga." A lot of new info about the game's long road to completion comes from an article at The Ringer written by Ben Lindbergh, who spoke with former members of Team Andromeda who had swelled to over 40 plus at the time and had worked almost around the clock for 3 years straight on the game. This was not typical in the 90s, as most development teams usually range in the average of about dozen to 2 dozen for a big 3D project. That was, however, what Sega felt needed to happen in order to produce a dazzling game on their first 3D system, and to hopefully push some consoles out the door. Their previous gambles, the Sega CD and 32X, let's just say didn't pan out, so they were desperate for a hit that would finally move some hardware. This importance was also doubly so because many classic Sega mascots and franchises made popular on the Genesis/Mega Drive wound up missing the trip to Planet Saturn for various reasons that usually always amount to Sega being Sega. There was no Sonic, Altered Beast, Streets of Rage, Echo, and of course, no experts. Therefore, they were very keen to foster new franchises instead, although how successful they were remains pretty definitively not very. The idea of expanding the universe Futetsugi had created with an RPG specifically came from his producer and boss Yoji Ishii, and while everyone was on board, they all soon came to a realization: no one had ever attempted something like this before. While Square were still dropping polygonal characters onto static 2D backgrounds and relying solely on text for their story, Team Andromeda set out to create backgrounds, props, characters, dragons, just everything in full 3D, which was nothing short of crazy on the Saturn, which was always designed to handle scaling sprites in 2D art a little bit more smoothly. So everything they were attempting here was nothing short of trailblazing from a design point of view, and that extended to the presentation as well. Saga would be entirely voiced in Japanese and have a smattering of cutscenes that featured the constructed language Panzerese. Dragoon 1 and 2 featured it as well, but the team felt its inclusion here was essential to keep things authentic and unique. 90 minutes of pre-rendered CGI cutscenes would also be produced to flesh out the story, which was again incredibly ambitious when compared to other games at the time, which typically offered brief snippets, intros, endings, stuff like that. While Team Andromeda had produced some for the previous two games, an hour and a half was a huge increase in the workload. All of these aspects were things that Final Fantasy wouldn't have even attempted until almost 4 years later, and on a new generation of hardware. So it's no surprise that Saga, which was scheduled for 1997, was further delayed into 1998. Unfortunately, this decision was also something that would go on to be a death blow, not just for the project, but the team itself. The idea of a big RPG being completed in just 3 years nowadays seems scoffable at best, but in the 90s, 3+ years spent on only one title was an ice age, and during said ice age, Sega upper management began to realize that the Saturn's sales outlook wasn't getting any better, but rather much worse. Competition from Nintendo and especially Sony was fierce, and the original high price point of Sega's machine and lack of any true marquee titles saw it vastly underperform when compared to the N64 and the mighty PlayStation single ballin'. For Team Andromeda though, they just focused on making the best game they could, and since no one had ever attempted to make an RPG in this exact style before, everything needed to be made from scratch. A fully 3D RPG with beautiful visuals, that kind of game hardly existed anywhere in the world, which meant that no matter what aspect of the game we worked on, we had the challenge of making it entirely from whole cloth, said Futetsugi in the Ringer interview. They couldn't use any technology or code elsewhere from within Sega's libraries or from any other teams, as they were figuring things out as they went along. With no real templates to work off of, and with the team having no experience working within RPG conventions, they decided to cut out a lot of the superfluous mechanics and bloat. There was certainly a cast of characters in Panzer Dragoon Saga, but you only ever controlled 2. Mercenary Edge and a wild dragon which befriends him. While Edge could attack enemies, he could also call his dragon down to swoop overhead and to dole out special attacks, and they could do as many actions in whatever order they wanted, as long as their gauge still had some Panzer juice in it. This led to a very free-form fighting system. No, not that one. That again did away with the turn-based nature seen in pretty much every RPG on the market. The main plot was basic, but focused. Edge takes it upon himself to save a mysterious kidnapped girl by the name of Azel, who seemed to have origins dating back to ancient times. Since party management was not really a thing, you only ever had to worry about the two characters, it let Team Andromeda pay special attention to all those other aspects I outlined earlier. So there was a less cluttered cast of characters, very little in the way of menu navigation, and completely cut out the slow starts, which are pretty indicative of a lot of RPGs. Instead of waking up in a forest and killing level 1 rats for a few hours until you get to the first town, you are almost instantly taking on giant monsters and doing dungeon plunging with your dragon as soon as control is given to the player. They also made the conscious decision to cut things out like fetch quests and pretty much eliminate the need to grind. However, this all leads back to those long hours I mentioned before, and Sega management and Fudetsugi himself had no experience in leading a team as large as they had working on Saga. When the core team assigned to Zwei had finished up, they then joined the new employees that had started work on Saga the year previous. Lamentably, since the new staff had no experience working on any Dragoons, it inevitably led to conflicts among the ranks. Sega upper management then put pressure on Fudetsugi to continually rally the troops to keep them on track with deadlines, even if it meant being a bit demanding. I was exhausted, the team was exhausted, and since there were a lot of people on the team to deal with the massive volume of work, and at the time there wasn't as much managerial know-how for handling large projects, there was a lot of pressure to domineer over the staff. I remember being pretty rough on them too. As the months dragged on, Team Andromeda had to face more personal tragedies in the lead up to launch. 2 staff members, one of them holding a senior position, passed away suddenly. While these deaths obviously affected the game, they left a lasting effect on the remaining staff, and Fudetsugi even more. The passing of our staff members produced a huge shock in all of us. One of the persons who died had a close relationship with me, so their loss affected me for a long time. Now, over on the other side of the Pacific, Sega of America had the added challenge of translating Panzer Dragoon for their side of the globe, which wasn't exactly easy. Sega's overall decline in the late 1990s left the once prominent part of the company, the American one, completely gutted, going from over 2,000 employees to just 200. This left many franchises, which were popular in the West, left out in the cold, which we've covered once or twice on this channel before. Thus, it was up to just 2 people to localize the game, and unfortunately, the Saturn was doing far worse in the rest of the world when compared to Japan. Final Fantasy VII's stellar success, selling over 10 million copies worldwide, was enough for Sega to start planning their next console and try to combat the rise of Sony's dominance. Again, something I've covered before. Chris Lusich and Matt Underwood were those 2 Sega of America employees, and quickly became enraptured with the builds of Saga that were coming in, astounded at the work that Team Andromeda were putting out. Therefore, they tried their absolute best to adapt it for Western audiences, knowing full well that by the time the game actually released, very few people would ever even play it. We worked every night until 4 AM to get it all done. I actually had severe bronchitis on the last day it was in test, and I was sent home. I wanted to be there for the end, but I was coughing up blood, literally. I was trying to tell people, no, I'm good. Such was the fervor, the belief that Panzer Dragoon Saga was something special, something truly groundbreaking and worthy of praise. But the problem was that Sega was already moving on, diverting resources and budget to the then upcoming Dreamcast, which as an overall move for the company was smart, but it had the unfortunate side effect of leaving any remaining Saturn projects by the wayside. While disagreements and friction between the old and new staff members continued up until the Japanese launch of the game, and Chris and Matt burning the midnight oil to get the localized version done, it fortunately wasn't all for naught. Upon its release, Panzer Dragoon Saga garnered some truly incredible reviews, with many outlets saying it was among the best RPGs ever made, with some magazines scoring it higher than Final Fantasy VII. Now, as good as that must have felt to all the people who put their blood, sweat, and tears into the project, it unfortunately didn't translate to sales. While the Saturn's waning popularity in the West was certainly a factor, the available shelf space in toy electronics stores was a shadow of what it used to enjoy. The massive switch in genre from rail shooter to RPG probably confused a number of gamers as well. Imagine if, say, a new Virtua Cop suddenly shifted to being an RPG, there would definitely need to be a period of acclimatization. In Japan, Azul Panzer Dragoon RPG shifted somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 copies. Sales data from this time is notoriously hard to pin down, but numbers in the rest of the world were far more dismal. Roughly 25,000 copies were ever even produced for North America, as Saturn game manufacturing was on its way out. Complicating matters was the fact that to fit in all that CGI and speech, Saga needed to be a 4-disc game, so the decision to limit the amount of copies produced was probably also a financial one. And if that doesn't depress you, well then this certainly will. Europe only ever received 1,000 copies, making it one of the rarest games in that region. Well, not expressly due to the low sales, and certainly not due to the quality of the product, Sega then disbanded Team Andromeda soon after, folding much of them into Smilebit as more of a belt-tightening measure. Sega did a lot of restructuring around this time in order to put as much money and resources into the Dreamcast's upcoming debut as they could, and Andromeda was one of those teams sacrificed for that dream. Fortunately, however, the world of Panzer Dragoon didn't stop there, as Smilebit then produced the stellar and much more traditional sequel Panzer Dragoon Orta for the Xbox in 2002, which can still be played on modern Xbox consoles today. It even includes a rock-solid port of the game that started it all, but sadly, no Panzer II. And even more sadly, no Saga. Not long after Orta's release, Fudetsugi moved on to Konami, then Microsoft, where he helped shape the world of Phantom Dust until he founded Grounding Inc. in 2007. While his first title, the codenamed Project Draco, was cancelled for the Xbox 360, it moved over to the Xbox One and was redubbed to Crimson Dragon, which very clearly meant to invoke the Panzer titles of old. While an admirable attempt, it didn't exactly win over many critics, and I can't fathom why. While Fudetsugi had hoped the game would be a big enough success to inspire sequels, that obviously didn't pan out, which was a shame because he had plans to even spin it off into an RPG as well. As for the Panzer Dragoon remake, well, Sega commissioned relatively unknown developer Megapixel to head it up, and while it was a Switch exclusive for a time, it's now releasing across a variety of formats. Fudetsugi, however, was not involved with its creation, so unfortunately the takeaway from all of this is that while some Panzer Dragoon titles have been preserved, Sega doesn't really acknowledge the Saturn-era games all that much, digitally or otherwise. Nowadays, factory-sealed copies of Saga retail for thousands of dollars, and non-complete versions usually in the hundreds, so no matter how you slice it, experiencing Panzer Dragoon's sublime and unique foray into the realm of the RPG is not the most straightforward procedure. Now, while on the subject, it has been rumored but never confirmed that Sega simply lost the source code during the closure of Team Andromeda and its big 90s reshuffling. Now, while this rumor certainly has some credence, other assets and materials for other franchises were indeed lost and or discarded. Fudetsugi himself has said he doesn't know the whole truth of it. And who knows, maybe someday someone will find the source code laying around on a CD somewhere. This is one of those rare stories where the development, while certainly tough and filled with moments of doubt and uncertainty, still persevered and resulted in an incredible product. But due to factors simply outside the developer's control, it never found a significant audience. Fudetsugi recalls, "I wanted to create something with permanence, something that would remain in the hearts of the group of people I made the game for. Something for those who were starving for a new experience, something that could stay fresh and unique 10 years after its release, something that doesn't look like any other game." And in that, he very much succeeded, even if very few people ever got to experience it. If you know of any other tragically tragic tales of developmental tragedy, let me know in the comments below or soar on over to my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching! Welcome everyone. This isn't the first time we've covered BioWare here on What Happened, and in all likelihood this won't be the last time we'll be covering BioWare here on What Happened. But thanks to Big Boss Zachary down at the Flophouse VIP Patreon, we're going to be instead turning back the clock to what might be their first big misfire, the first chink in their armor, 2008's Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood, or as I prefer to call it, Sonic Chronic. It's 2005, and BioWare is fast becoming one of the hottest studios in the world, having just delivered the fondly remembered, best-selling, highly reviewed Jade Empire, which 15 years later has just sort of been ignored by Microsoft, and EA, and BioWare themselves, and anyway, bolstered by the success of that plus KOTOR, something even bigger was coming down the pike, the M to the A to the double S effect. So they were on the precipice of superstardom, if they weren't there already. Now, around the same time frame, a similar explosion of popularity was going on in the world of handhelds, thanks to the Nintendo double-screen ballin'. Taking advantage of this, BioWare then tasked a very small team to investigate what they could do in the space, and they came to the most natural conclusion, making a Sonic the Hedgehog RPG exclusive to the DS with touchscreen-only controls that ended in a whimper as it promised a sequel that never came. So, what happened? Well, while such a pitch did and still does sound incredibly random on paper and in practice, it wasn't entirely random, just mostly. In an interview with Nintendo Power, former BioWare founders Ray Mazeika and Greg Zeschuk explained why this was a thing that indeed happened. We know Sega president Simon Jeffrey very well. He worked with us on Knights of the Old Republic when he was at LucasArts. I think we were just talking to him about various possibilities for working together. We talk periodically, and I think we were discussing our passion for Sonic at one point. We thought it would just be cool to do something together and see what we could make happen, and it just kind of developed from there. Now, while that seems simple enough, there's another interesting connection here, and if you allow me just a moment, I can crazily connect those dots for you. In April of 2020, a mediocre YouTuber made a video about Sega's failed reboot of Golden Axe Beast Rider, and Sega of America hires one Simon Jeffrey, formerly of LucasArts, as their new CEO to hopefully bring in sweeping changes into their business model, since they were hot off the heels of leaving the hardware business. So yeah, Simon Jeffries made a lot of friends when he worked at LucasArts, and those friendships continued on once he left the company, which coincidentally many have cited as the beginning of the end of LucasArts in general. When Sega hired him to head up their US operations, he tried a lot of different things to get the company a lot of back on track, and it's this close relationship with BioWare that led to the creation of Sonic Chronic. Off the bat, though, there were some issues. BioWare was accustomed to working on the most cutting-edge machines, PCs and the Xbox primarily, so adjusting to the very restrictive and underpowered nature of the DS took some extra time. Scaling back their usual ambition was also a concern, because up to that point, all of BioWare's worlds were richly detailed RPGs with a lot of depth, and a lot of production time. The smaller team assigned to the project therefore had less turns of the clock when compared to previous ones, which resulted in some cut corners here and there. Now, to present those cut corners, I have here a special guest who can further illustrate what went down with Sonic Chronic and the Darkness Bunch. He's a big Sonic fan himself, loves his coffee, and...
Nah, dude.
What? What do you mean, nah, dude?
Yeah, no, I'm done with this game. I covered it in 2008 and 2017, and I enjoy it less and less each time, so I'm good. I'm doing the other thing.
Oh, the other thing we're gonna be talking about later?
Yeah, the other thing.
Gotcha, the other thing. Anyway, the Sonic team, no, not that Sonic, the BioWare team headed up by Mark Dara, who had been with the company since its founding and is one of the few remaining original employees, were in a unique and not entirely enviable position. The The looming buyout from EA would have certainly put a bit of pressure on them to finish up at the earliest convenience, because while EA's big power play would never outright cancel Sonic's LARPing adventure, since Sega's contract predated it, it's still natural to assume that the 30-person team was wanted elsewhere to help out on bigger projects. You know, these guys. There's plenty of evidence of a rushed game here, with one of the most notable pieces being the, the music. Apparently, BioWare had crafted an all-original soundtrack, but due to some still unnamed legal issues, much of the work couldn't be used. This allegedly occurred very late into development, and with very few options afforded to them, the team simply grabbed some random Sonic jams off the internet, I think, and shoved them wherever they could fit. Over half the game's OST is just low-quality MIDI remixes of old tunes, which is a far cry from the mission statement laid out in that Nintendo Power interview I mentioned earlier. We were interested in making a really high-end handheld project. That was the other thing that was actually very important to us. We play a ton of handheld games, and generally, most of the high-quality handheld stuff is coming out of Japan. There isn't a lot of North American AAA handheld development going on, so we thought it was a great chance to team up and do that. So yeah, that doesn't really jive with that initial plan, so it's clear that at the very least, something went down with the music, and it went down hard. Now, as for the story, well, it also kinda has a rushed feel to it, and that can't be more evident than in the ending itself. BioWare added a new villain, characters, and lore, but spoilers, it simply just ends on a massive cliffhanger that begs for a continuation. Now, the intent here was to probably, continue it, but designing any video game with a cliffhanger ending always has a 50% chance to bite you in the ass, as almost no game is ever guaranteed a sequel. It's a little worse here though, since most people play RPGs for the story, so concluding with an incredibly unsatisfying ending is a bit unsatisfying. Upon release, Sonic Chronicles wasn't exactly greeted with the response that a high-quality AAA RPG would receive, something that BioWare typically enjoyed. Many people felt a bit let down that at its core, it was an incredibly basic RPG that just kinda existed. With dull environments, slow movement speed, the aforementioned audio issues, and the clunky touchscreen controls really didn't make it feel like the high-quality, polished handheld watermark that they were going for. Now, there was one area where it did excel in most people's minds, and that was in the characterization and dialogue. Sonic and his oh-so-popular friends were fleshed out better than they had ever had up to that point, which was a breath of fresh air when you consider that.
So, how did you know it wasn't the real one?
Tails! Because you just told me, Fox Boy.
Sonic characterization was always kinda. Suffice to say, the reviews were decidedly average, but the game wasn't bad or broken, and honestly, it laid enough groundwork that a sequel could potentially improve just about everything, and hopefully continue that cliffhanger. In fact, according to some employees at BioWare, specifically Sonic Chronicles associate producer Dorian Keegan, a sequel was being mulled around. I would be surprised to see Sega refusing a sequel opportunity if the game is indeed successful. In any case, our team is definitely ready to work on a sequel. We even have a precise idea of what to do next if this were to happen, and if you play the game, you might find some hints on what that idea is. Well, it just so happens that the game was indeed not successful, either due to the fact that a Sonic RPG didn't exactly mesh well to the platforming nature of the franchise, or, I don't know why. In most figures that I can find, it seems like it didn't even crack 1 million copies sold, which if you compare it to like the billion DSs that were sold, was a bit dire. This is probably one of the reasons why Sega felt it wasn't an idea worth continuing. But there was maybe one more big reason. Sonic Chronicles' problems actually didn't stop there. In fact, they had barely begun. But before they've barely begun, let me throw to... This is the thing, right?
Yes, it is.
Alright, okay, so a man that needs no introduction...
Thank you, you're too kind. So about 3 months after the debut of the Brotherhood of Darkness, a copyright claim was filed against both Sega and Archie Comics Publishing by Ken Penders, one of the writers of the Blue Blurs official comic book series that had been running since 1992, with Penders having written almost all of it. His case alleged that he owned all of the unique characters that had been born from deep within the Sonic pit store in said run, and that they were his own intellectual property. Now, Sega and Archie Comics were not going to take this lying down, which is something I would be saying if they didn't do exactly that. They simply ignored Penders' case for almost 2 years, providing no communication to him, his lawyers, or the copyright gods. The case kept progressing regardless, and when it showed no signs of slowing down, Archie and his Riverdale law firm finally filed a cease and desist order against Penders. They alleged that since the comic book was based on a licensed franchise, that all the work was the property of Sega, and that Penders had no legal right to any of it. For an example, Nintendo allowed Rare to utilize its characters for Donkey Kong Country, but that didn't mean Rare owned K. Rool or fucking Lanky Kong, not even sure why they want him. It just meant that you were working on someone else's IP. You don't own that IP, or any of the OCs you made under that IP. It's just not how it works. Now, since both Sega and Archie ghosted the case for so long and delayed things even further with the cease and desist, the statute of limitations on his initial trademark filing ran out, and thus was eventually dismissed. Mr. Penders denied his satisfaction, then filed another lawsuit against Sega and Electronic Arts for copyright infringement, citing similarities between his work and Sonic Chronicles. This was specifically in regards to the Nocturnus clan and his own Dark Legion, which just might be some of the most generic and common antagonistic forces a video game can have. I digress. This lawsuit lingered on for almost 2 more years until October of 2013, when Archie Comics claimed that Penders had signed a work-for-hire contract, which would have invalidated all of his claims. However, their team of lawyers, headed up by Jughead Jones, were not actually able to produce said contract, and since Penders wasn't going to go, oh yeah, that thing, I got it right here somewhere. So the judge had no choice but to dismiss the whole thing again. That wasn't going to be the end of it though, as Penders had stated his intention to further pursue the matter, so in an outstanding example of, just fuck it, Archie Comics and Penders reached an undisclosed settlement, and to further avoid any other legal complications, Archie also decided to just grab a Chaos Emerald and to induce Chaos Control! And to just nuke the entire continuity, erasing dozens of original characters, especially any echidnas. Fortunately, since they were clearly the property of Sega, both Knuckles and Tikal survived that great purge though. As you can imagine, comic book nerds and Sonic nerds, just nerds in general, weren't happy about this considering how much material was being erased and rebooted, but it was the only surefire way to wipe their hands of the whole affair. Logically then, if they wanted to keep said hands clean, then the Sonic Chronicles storyline would pretty much need to stay abandoned. If Sega did decide to do something with it, then Penders would be within his legal rights to raise a legal stink once more, and just, look, everyone is so tired of this. This, coupled with the low sales, is the real reason why the game will most likely never see a sequel. The mid to late 2000s was a rough time for Sonic in general, believe me, I know that, you know that, your grandma knows that. And while Sonic Chronicles itself wasn't some inexcusable affront to gaming, it really didn't deserve to have all this baggage attached to it. Now it's true that the fastest thing alive doesn't perfectly fit into an RPG mold as of yet, but it still would have been nice if we had another shot at it. However, as we've seen, due to poor timing, a rushed schedule, and just plain old bad luck, it didn't work out, and honestly,
that's no good.
Spoken like a true Sonic fan. Man, this thing sure didn't work out, but if X, Y, or Z were completely different, it might have been awesome.
That's patronizing, bitch, but you're right, it's our strength and our curse.
That's great. Well, thank you, Johnny, for joining us on the What Happened stage, and also, what can the folks at home expect on your channel next?
Well, first off, thank you for inviting me for this episode. It's always a good time to get involved in more Sonic goodness. But hey, some call me Johnny. I review video games for a living. You can find all the delicious morsels in my Johnny Versus series, where I like to review a collection of games in dedicated marathons. In fact, I'm getting ready to start one of my biggest passion projects that I've been looking forward to for a long time, a Final Fantasy marathon. Got a lot to say about that series from my personal history, so you should tune into my channel if you're at all interested. And in the meantime, you can check out my Kingdom Hearts videos, my Metal Gear Solid videos, and need I mention the Sonic videos. Whatever you decide to do, I appreciate your time and company. Please stay safe out there, and wear a mask for fuck's sake.
And if you folks at home know of any other misfortunate anthropomorphic misfires, let me know in the comments below, spin dash over to my Twitter, or grind the rails over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss and nominate the subject of a future episode. See you next time, and thanks for watching. Welcome to another face-stomping, power-bombing, hip-hopping episode of What Happened, the show that tries to make sense of the abject anarchy of the video game and movie industries, which always seem to be at their very max. With that subtle segue behind us, allow me to introduce you to Platinum Games' very first online multiplayer title, which sadly also doubles as their least played title. Wait, hang on, did we all just forget that Soul Cresta came out? Huh? Yeah, anyway, Anarchy Reigns, or Max Anarchy when in Japan, has to be one of their oddest experiments, a narrative sequel to 2009's Mad World that features the same universe, characters, and gameplay mechanics, but billed as a multiplayer-centric affair. It only released on the consoles where Mad World didn't, saw several big delays, and had a confusing release schedule along with some palpable friction between both studio and publisher. So, grab your tires, stop signs, and chainsaws. It's time to find out what happened to Anarchy Reigns.
Jack, just Jack.
It goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Platinum made a splash when they and Sega announced their ambitious partnership in 2008. The industry hadn't seen anything like this since the infamous Capcom 5 reveal several years earlier, which is very much not a coincidence since both reveals involved many of the same game developers. The initial Sega announcement was comprised of 3 games: Bayonetta for the PS3 and 360, Mad World for the Wii, and of course Infinite Space for the DS, which everyone tends to forget. The relevant title here is of course Mad World, a high-contrast, blood-soaked deathmatch with timeless 2000s era attitude.
At least he didn't feel anything, except for that fucking train hitting him at 120 miles an hour.
Despite a modest amount of hype and marketing, the story of Jack Cayman didn't really entice the average Wii owner at the time, with sales data putting it at less than 100,000 copies sold across North America and Japan, most likely because the average Wii owner would have needed their parents' permission to buy it. Ho-ho! Wii jokes in 2022, people! Sega's Mike Hayes stated later in 2010 that critically it got a lot of acclaim, but commercially it wasn't the success we wanted it to be. Clearly, that was a mismatch with the Wii audience, particularly in terms of the amount of cross-ownership between Wii and the other home platforms. If you're gonna play a mature-rated game, you're gonna get your 360, PC, or PS3 out to do so, but you can't knock us for having a go. Platinum and Sega would continue to work together on Shinji Mikami's Vanquish and today's subject, Anarchy Reigns, which was scheduled to release in 2011, less than a year after its announcement, worldwide on both the PS3 and 360.
Bullshit! Bullshit!
Now, it's actually rather important that this was the 5th collaboration between both companies. Why? Well, I'll tell you. I spoke to a source who's familiar with the matter, and they informed me that the initial contract between Platinum and Sega was only for their first 4 games, and after that, their dealings would transition to a more game-by-game basis. Unfortunately, none of those first 4 collabs were the hits they were looking for, not even Bayonetta, which was still their most successful game at that time. So it wasn't really in Sega's best interest to re-up that initial contract. According to my source, that contract was really good, but strictly in Platinum's favor. They had almost complete freedom in making their games as they saw fit, and once they were happy with them, it was Sega's job to just shut their mouths and print the discs. So, Anarchy Reigns marked a new phase of their relationship, one which gave Sega far far more authority. Platinum, however, loved what they had created with Mad World, a bunch of bounty hunters running around in hyper-violent contests, styling on each other, and talking shit in equal measure. That's so Platinum. But even my source expressed that the team realized that the Wii was not the best place to grow such a franchise, so they decided to migrate over to the HD platforms this time around. As you can imagine though, this presented its own unique challenges. From a marketing perspective, it wouldn't exactly be wise to release Mad World 2 on machines that had no Mad World 1, and Sega was very, yeah, no thanks, in regards to porting and publishing it again after it had floundered at retail initially, so the compromise was making a semi-sequel spin-off that placed emphasis on multiplayer, which I think in hindsight wasn't much of a better idea. Regardless, Platinum mentioned how they had received a lot of requests from fans for a multiplayer game, and it just so happened that Mad World's eclectic cast of characters was a great starting point. Masaki Yamanaka, lead character designer on Mad World and now director on Anarchy Reigns, detailed just how quickly the project came together in a blog post on Platinum's website. Thanks to Oni Dino over on Twitter for the translation work here. We wanted to design a game that would be just as exciting as fighting games were when they were first introduced to the world. With that in mind, we hit the ground running on development. We used Platinum Games' forte, 3D action combat, as a foundation, added in mind games found in the 1v1 fighting genre, and incorporated some FPS-like strategy aspects that online gamers love. We started with a working prototype on PC by reusing the characters from Mad World. We threw them in square-shaped arenas and were pretty surprised at how enjoyable it instantly was. He wasn't kidding when they say they reused Mad World characters. As you see in these teeny tiny screenshots here, they literally dropped in Jack's old black and white model. As to why that same unique art style wasn't carried over into Anarchy Reigns, my source said that it was felt that the Sin City-esque look was an element that had held back Mad World. You know, the thing that made it unique. This wasn't a sentiment that came from Platinum, mind you, but Sega. Since they were running the show now, the decision was made to go for a more traditional color scheme. But to be fair, having to parse all the information from a 12-player online deathmatch with only 3 colors might have been a bit much. When the game was first shown at the start of 2011, it was already looking far along, but the inevitable complications that would arise from the team developing their first online-focused game would make that autumn release date look less and less likely. As Platinum were figuring out the flow of how matches in Anarchy Reigns played out, they ran into design issues they hadn't encountered in their previous games, as multiplayer presents unique problems you don't see in single player. Yamanaka had a lot of interesting insight to share when it came to these problems. We design our single player games so you feel pretty badass after doing just one move, but in PvP, the other player has the same capabilities. This means the more powerful we make the players, the more chaotic the battles get in terms of speed. We identified problems as development went on, like players clumping together in one area, or a third party swooping in and stealing a kill from out of nowhere. Anticipating this, we conceived the idea of action trigger events, and incorporated an AI that would control these events to scatter players about or bring them together. Despite these issues, Yamanaka said they eventually turned a corner on most of them. Figuring out all these design problems would see the game getting its first delay by slipping to January 2012. But then, just a month before that, Sega of America's Gary Knight stated, "Anarchy Reigns brings a new take to the brawler genre, and we've decided to take a little more time to deliver the full knockout punch. I can't reveal much now, but it's something to do with scale. Let's just say traditional one-on-one or 2 versus 2 fighters will be a thing of the past."
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
That's a pretty massive delay for a game that was just about to release. What happened there? According to my source, Platinum just needed more time to work out the kinks of the online experience, as apparently very few members of the team had ever shipped a game where online was such a prominent feature. Staff also tried to lobby management to let them develop fully featured multiplayer lobbies, but these requests fell on deaf ears at both Platinum and Sega alike, which was unfortunately still a common attitude towards online play at that time. Coupled with that, designing your first multiplayer game to be a 12-player competitive brawler was never going to be easy, just based on the genre alone. Ensuring that connections remain consistent and reliable while a dozen detailed 3D characters were smacking each other around in multi-tiered environments is like a lot, and the modest staff and budget Anarchy Reigns had certainly didn't help matters. In fact, a lot of Platinum's workforce were starting to be allocated towards other projects, like Metal Gear Rising and the wonderful 101, so Platinum turned to frequent collaborator Valuewave, you might remember them from our God Hand episode, to pitch in. Even with everyone putting in the hours though, many at the studio knew the online infrastructure just wasn't where it needed to be. Sega of America started to lose more and more faith in the game as a result, which came to a head that May, when the publisher announced that the Anarchy would reign in Japan as scheduled on July 5th, but that it no longer had a release date in North America. The fuck? Platinum weren't especially jazzed about this, and rather than keep silent or toe the line with a generic "please look forward to future announcements," they reached out to fans, saying, "We worked really hard to make sure everybody could get the game on time. The game is fully localized. If you buy the Japanese version, or any version, it's going to have all the languages in it. We really wanted everybody online around the world to play together at the same time, but unfortunately, that's not going to happen. In the West, Sega is looking for the best time to put it out. It will still be out in July in Japan. There will still be ways for you to get it if you know where to go. We're still 100% behind the game, and we still want to connect with you and play with you and have a good time. So let's make sure that happens no matter what bad news we get." Sega didn't even officially comment on all of this until a month later via their Twitter, where they announced that both the NA and European versions were now releasing in 2013. The reason? No reason at all, actually. The release of Anarchy Reigns has been re-evaluated. We now expect to launch in Europe and America in Q1 of 2013. This came as a shock to Platinum, and especially their CEO, Atsushi Inaba, who reacted to the news in a series of tweets. "Hi all. I wanted to make an official comment on the Western release of Anarchy Reigns, known as Max Anarchy in Japan. First of all, we are done with all international versions of Anarchy Reigns. The delay is not due to further development on the game. Also, even though the release dates will be different, the content of both the Japanese and Western versions will be 100% the same. Today's Q1 2013 release news was the first we'd heard of it. Even if we wanted to, we can't comment as we're still in the dark officially. There's some concern that this will push back the Japanese release date. It will not. The game will be released in Japan on July 5th, 2012. Finally, I want to sincerely apologize to all the fans worldwide for all the confusion this situation has caused. Though we are the game's developers, we can only do so much about this. However, we hope you can continue to support Anarchy Reigns and look forward to playing it with us in the future. Thank you. So, if Platinum were done, like even the localizations, why did everyone else in the world have to wait a further 6 months? My source indicated that Sega of America and Europe just didn't view the game as a priority, and its expectations of success were low, real low. And given the retail reaction to Mad World, it may have been understandably low. So they had looked at their calendar year and felt that the traditionally dead month of January would be the most ideal grave in which to dump the game. Now, if you know anything about most Platinum fans, you'd be aware that one of the best ways to describe them would be rabid. If one of their newest games works on any console regardless of the territory, since it was made to be region-free, why wait half a year? Many went to the import website du jour, which saw their most hardcore fans playing it that very summer. But when the dead month of January finally rolled around, it turned out that it wasn't that dead. Sega had set Anarchy Reigns' release date 1 week before Capcom's DMC reboot was set to debut, and just a few weeks after that, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, also by Platinum, would Zendatsu fans' wallets as well. What does Zendatsu mean? It means cut and take. Maybe to level that playing field, Sega decided that the game was probably an easier sell at the budget price of $29.99, but it's more likely they just had zero faith in it, cause that's some Spyborg shit right there. Lamentably, neither this nor a Bayonetta DLC code being included with new copies of the game outside of Japan helped to get the butts in seats. The online play could still be very stuttery and unreliable, but if you could get a smooth match going, players found a frantic battlefield filled with sick characters and a very engaging but accessible combat system. Fortunately, Platinum was wise enough to offer a single-player story mode as well, and while it was obviously made very frugally, repurposing all the multiplayer maps, it had a large amount of cutscenes and some very sharp character dialogue. Critics were pretty split on the mode though, with some feeling it was a valiant attempt that added to the package, while others saw it as a repetitive slog. Maybe part of the reason it was looked on rather harshly was that for many it was the only mode they could really play, since it was difficult to even connect to games both before and after launch. Oh, and there was no split-screen multiplayer option as an alternative. One thing most critics and fans did agree on was Platinum's choice of music, another outstanding soundtrack filled with some super hot hip-hop bangers.
So you can stick around because it's gonna be a thriller in this world. Ain't no other option for a killer. I just gotta get the cash, gotta get it done.
All said, the game scored a 73 Metacritic average on the 360, the most reviewed platform, which is not a bad showing. But this was the good part of its Western release, because the sales were the other part. I can't find any reliable numbers for North America or Europe, but in Japan, it only moved just a bit over 40,000 units across both platforms. My source wasn't privy to accurate worldwide numbers, but was sure they were between atrocious and really bad. Just going by the data I was able to sift through, in all likelihood, Anarchy Reigns actually sold even less than Mad World overall. So obviously, this is where Sega and Platinum's relationship was chainsawed in half, because it's been 9 years and this was their last game together. Sega passed on their option to publish sequels to Bayonetta, with Nintendo picking up that ball, but they did at least put out 2 re-releases for their better performing Platinum collabs. If you're somehow hoping against hope for an Anarchy Reigns revival like I am, don't! My source said they'd be incredibly surprised if anyone on either side has ever expressed any interest, and even if there was, it would require far more logistical work than offline games like Bayo and Vanquish. While I think Platinum had an idea that was brimming with potential here, I think focusing more on local multiplayer or campaign co-op and being completely unrelated to Mad World would have been the safer choice, because Sega, and frankly most mainstream consumers, seem to have very little interest in Jack Kamen and his Mad World. That being said, it feels like a bit of a rookie mistake to make their first online game an ambitious one, but you only learn if you make a few mistakes. Now, in 2022, if Platinum were to tackle a persistent online action game, I'm sure they could produce a massive, industry-changing success that would be remembered by all. If you know of any other unfortunate action anomalies, let me know in the comments below, holler at your boy on Twitter, or enter the mad world that is the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss and nominate what you want to see coming up. See you next time, and thanks for watching!
I got you right where I want you. There is nowhere to run to.
Welcome back to another episode of That's Right, Sonic. Your Sonic is all that Sonic's. Wow, Simpsons reference in the first 3 seconds. We have an all-time record there, folks! The last time we checked in with the Blue Blur was all the way back in the mid-90s, which, as we all know, was a decade of extremes. But it's now finally time for us to go fast into the future of 4 years ago with 2017's Sonic Forces, a request you've all relentlessly bombarded me with ever since its release. Now, even to this day, Forces is still a bit of an enigma in the puckering blue hole that is Sonic's video game career, with plenty of hearsay and hoopla made about its development. The one thing we absolutely 100% legit for sure know, however, is that it didn't exactly go to plan, and unfortunately resulted in a critically maligned 3D entry that most fans are very much split on.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I roll.
So strap on your speed shoes and slip on your favorite Sonic shirt, rookie. It's time to find out what happened to Sonic Forces.
Sonic, how I hate him.
Some of you might recall that in 2013, Sonic took a bit of an extended stay in Nintendo Land as per an exclusivity contract between old rivals Sega and Nintendo. Did I say extended stay? I meant locked in the Wii U prison, with the key enthusiastically swallowed by Big the Cat. So during this time, while Sega was giving bad news to Big Red Button and was trying new things with varying levels of success with Lost World, the PS4 and Xbox One, which had just launched, were gonna remain dry and parched of the precious Sonic juices that fans crave. Now, even though they had lost a lot of time in the Wii U jail, Sonic Team felt the best and most responsible path forward was to upgrade the Hedgehog engine to better take advantage of these more powerful machines, especially since they had been using that engine ever since 2008's Unleashed. Please stop that. This was hopefully to avoid the situation that occurred with Sonic 2006. Remember that one? Oh, you don't? Well, allow me to jog your memory. Sega demanded that there needed to be a new Sonic game to celebrate his 15th anniversary, which hung an immovable release date over the team. The same team that was suddenly split in twain so they could produce 2 distinct games, all while building a brand new game on a brand new engine on brand new hardware. They then had to contend with getting several senior staff members headhunted by Yuji Naka, who quit halfway through the project, all while Sega refused to hire or allocate more staff. Happy birthday, Sonic! If you'd like a more detailed breakdown of this cursed tale, you can hear all about it in this video right here. Back to Forces. Now, Sonic Team is sorta known for course correcting every time they do anything, really, and after combing through fan opinion, they felt there was general apathy and burnout on the more whimsical, happy-go-lucky natures of Colors and Lost World, and a fervent desire to return to the grittier, more cinematic storylines of Sonic 2006, and thus started to brainstorm what engine-wide improvements would work best to support that. The planning phase of the engine overhaul reportedly took time, a lot of time, ranging from a few months to a full year by some reports. It then took the technology and programming teams a good long while to put these plans into practice, which have again ranged from 1 to 2 years, but that's never been 100% confirmed. Now, that didn't mean the art, concept, and story teams were sitting with their gloved fingers up their butts. No, they were kicking around numerous ideas, trying to hone in on one that made the most sense for the franchise's future trajectory. And to be fair to them, there were a lot of potential places to take the IP, make a full-on continuation of a previous entry, reboot it from the ground up, do a prequel.
Everybody loves prequels.
Or just forge on ahead with another self-contained adventure that didn't necessarily connect to past games. Now, I think we can all agree this feels like a much more sound and forward-thinking plan, but of course, it came with its own problems and pitfalls that wouldn't be felt until much later. Because, quite frankly, it seems like it was this design phase, which was the wonky bolt in the machine, that sent stuff just slightly off the rails. Sonic Team spent a while trying to figure out what fans wanted, and eventually settled on a standalone adventure that suddenly had Eggman conquering 99% of the world, and a decent chunk of space to boot. The Sonic Team big boss, Takeshi Iizuka, laid out in an interview with Nintendo UK on who they were aiming to please with this new game. During development, we decided to target current Sonic fans and also casual gamers. However, in the Sonic fanbase, there are also those who started playing Sonic during the Mega Drive era. So we wanted to create a Sonic game that could also appeal to those old school Mega Drive players, and that's the reason why we created Sonic Mania. But we suspect there may also be many fans who enjoy playing both games. So for 2017, our aim is to please the entire Sonic fanbase. Now, he says we created Sonic Mania, which isn't exactly accurate, as that was developed by fan modder Christian Whitehead, as well as other staff members from independent studios Headcanon and Pagoda West Games. Now, again, deciding to cater to a completely separate demographic with a completely separate 2D title was without a doubt the better choice than trying to make a catch-all 3D game to try to appeal to every Sonic fan on Earth. Now, that sorta worked with Generations, but Iizuka, Nakamura, and the rest of Sonic Team didn't want to create a direct sequel to that, as it was meant to be more of a one-off concept to coincide with Sonic's 20th anniversary, despite them, randomly throwing in bits of Generations anyway.
It's been generations since I seen you. You okay?
So with the scenario and tone mostly settled on, what would be the gameplay hook? Well, it was apparently one that was another big fan request, and they were going to lean into it. And when I say lean into, I mean revolve the entire game around. Iizuka once again explains how this came to be. When we were thinking about the concept of Sonic Forces, we received a lot of fan letters and messages from fans where they wanted to create their own characters. So we listened to that and wanted to make their dreams come true. Aww. So that's one of the reasons why we created the custom characters system. If you happen to be one of those people that sent them a fan letter going, yeah, Sonic's okay, but I really want to make my own original character, well, lean in close, cause I have something to say. Good for you, I hope you're living your best life. So yeah, most of the adventure was going to task players with controlling their very own /69, the depressed Prego Edgewolf, who's referred to as the Rookie by the rest of the cast, and is an animal of few words. Now, while this change was not expressly bad, it didn't exactly make the Sonic experience any better or more immersive. And when you consider the energy spent programming a character creator, designing hundreds and hundreds of items and custom bits of clothing, and then testing every variation of horrible animal it could conjure, you can't help but think that same energy might have been better spent elsewhere. This is because, while the planning and technology phase was given a lot of time and leeway, the actual main production lifecycle of Sonic Forces was relatively short. Now, a Japanese Famitsu interview with Sonic Team seemed to imply that the core development lasted only a year, but this was apparently a mistranslation. The truth is that while the main development wasn't a scant 12 months, it probably wasn't all that much longer either. This is quite evident in a lot of areas of the game, from the main campaign being one of, if not the shortest 3D Sonic ever, clocking in at just 4 hours, but also due to a litany of cut content, story sequences, and dialogue that never made it into the final game. We know this because Sonic Force's Japanese script was leaked onto the vile nightmare landscape that is the internet in 2016, more than a year before its ship date. This early script was called by its original title of Sonic Wars, a change that was most likely done because saying the word wars in the title of a kid's game equals bad. Nintendo does what Sega don't. The main story was, by and large, the same thing that players wound up experiencing the next year, although there were still numerous minor and even a few major differences between what was planned and what was completed. The script had a more coherent flow and narrative, clarifying several events, character appearances, and key plot points that were left unfinished or unexplained in the final version. For example, classic Sonic appears and then vanishes for no reason in the final game, whereas in the early script implies he's secretly a Phantom Ruby construct.
Right, that makes sense, I think.
Infinite, the new villain, is made even more threatening and intense, beating the crap out of Sonic in an extended scene, while Mephiles, yes that Mephiles, was originally planned to appear in the final battle. In general, this draft was a good deal darker, more serious, and had even more implied violence, going so far as to have Eggman planning to have Sonic executed early on. But in the final game, he's vaguely going to be banished to space. This smacks of Sonic Team pushing hard, maybe too hard in one direction, only to get cold feet and to start cutting scenes and changing lines at the 11th hour. This left the finished game's story filled with plot holes and inconsistencies, as well as numerous black screens of text trying to fill in all the missing gaps. Many of these issues were pointed out by Aaron Weber, Director of Strategy and Communications at Sega of Japan. In that same leaked script, you can see his comments attributed by AAW pointing out many of the script's flaws, some of which did get changed, but the vast majority remained ignored.
We move forward with the plan.
Of course!
Tails defeats Eggman alone in SA1. Why is he suddenly so weak here? Is it just dramatic effect? Tails and Co. just let Sonic get captured? Big loophole here. Wait, what? Silver? Why is he here? Let's not call them the rookie. Buddy sounds childish. Why doesn't Tails remember the events of Generations? The line, "We're going in hard and fast," will be the most played line from the game on YouTube out of context videos. Then finally, there's his reaction to the game's finale, which once again saw Sonic's crew give him enough friendship energy to defeat the final boss. Ugh, we do this every single time. Generations and 06 and SA2 and all of them. Why? Outside of story, what the game struggled with the most was technical performance when it finally did launch towards the end of 2017, with most of those issues plaguing the Steam version. Things were rough on the very first day, highlighted by tons of bugs and crashes, including a nasty one that everyone just had to deal with. Upon completion of like the second or third missions, the game would just crash with no consistent way to circumvent it, and it affected the vast majority of rigs and configurations. Not only that, players reported crashes when just making their avatar, and even cited the simple sand particles in Mission 1 as the root cause for another, more random assortment of crashing. All of this resulted in an overwhelmingly negative rating on Steam, especially when it was revealed that Forces utilized de novo DRM, which many attributed to the game's poor performance. But wait, there's more!
Oh, come on, now what?
The Steam version also required you to always be online, something that so many people complained about that Sega eventually backed off and patched out, but not de novo, strangely enough. Despite removing it from older and even newer releases like Sonic Mania and Yakuza 0, as far as I can tell, Sonic Forces still has it. Developers/publishers, there is literally no advantage to ever trying to sneak that shit in. You're always gonna get caught, everyone's gonna complain, and any benefit you get will never outweigh the fan ire. Ever. Oof, and while things were better on console, it wasn't that much better. Due to the game's incredibly short playtime, underbaked narrative, various technical shortcomings, and lack of anything truly new or exciting about its gameplay, Forces wound up being the lowest reviewed Sonic Team title since The Black Knight or 2006? This was contrasted sharply by the stellar reviews and fan reception to Sonic Mania, which released just a few months earlier. Now, while it's nice fans of the Blue Blur had something to rally around in 2017, it also made Forces look even worse by comparison. Sales-wise, however, it seems things are more positive. While Sega has never officially provided hard numbers, Forces has been estimated to have at least cleared 1 million copies or more since its launch, with the Switch version being far and away the most popular. All of this was certainly a learning experience, and I know I say that at the end of every Sonic video, but I really mean it this time. The reception to Forces was enough for Sonic Team to take a good, long look at how best to approach the next game, whatever it winds up being called. Oh wait, it's actually going to be called Frontiers. With Iizuka saying, "I really hope that this new title releasing in 2022 lays the foundation for the following future Sonic titles, much like how Sonic Adventure laid the foundation for 20 years of Sonic titles after its release." Moreover, Aaron Weber gave his take on what modern Sonic development needs to do in order to succeed going forward. A lot of people are asking, when are we going to see a new game trailer, a new anything? This is the million-dollar question. This is a case where, if you've seen this change happen, back in the day, it used to be like every year it was a new Sonic game. As a result of that, there were a number of times when, because of that rush production schedule, quality of the games wouldn't be where they really needed to be. And so a few years ago, we actually said, that's gonna change going forward. We're gonna put more time into things, so that's gonna mean you're gonna have to wait longer between trailers and announcements, and that's kind of annoying because you just really want news. We're really excited for what's to come, but we can't really say anything right now. So, to sum it all up, while Sonic Team didn't have anything drastically go wrong with Forces, and it's not an inherently bad or broken game, well, not anymore. It's one of those 1,000 cuts style situations where a bunch of tiny problems resulted in a less than ideal experience that let down a lot of people in the end. Hopefully, they'll stick to their word and strike a balance between design and technology, where they can focus on a clear goal with enough time to properly execute it, and even more hopefully, Frontiers will be that game. And if it's not, well, I guess we'll all be back here doing this same old song and dance in 2022. If you know of any other problem-bound games that roll around at the speed of sound, let me know in the comments below, over on my Twitter, or take a tornado ride over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss and nominate what I tackle in a future episode. See you next time, and thanks for watching! So it's been about, a few weeks since the last video about Sega, so here's another one! Welcome to What Happened, the show where we discuss various video game and movies in a frank and professional manner. And thanks to Flophouse VIP member C24U, we are now adding entire video game consoles to our ever-growing list of clientele. Ah yes, as the thumbnail so subtly hinted, we are taking a look at the Sega Dreamcast, the perennial most underrated console of all time Grand Slam winner, that while had a lot of positives, also has the dubious distinction of being what caused Sega to leave the hardware business. But did it? Yes. But did it really? No. Well, let's dispel that confusion and really dive into the Dreamcast, really find out what makes it tick, and most importantly, what it's thinking. Now, if you're a younger gamer, you might know Sega as the company that puts out games with either Sonic or Kiryu on the cover, maybe a Total War here and there, and sells the same 30 ROMs every couple of months. But they have a long-lasting, almost 60-year history that, for the purposes of this story, we'll need to briefly touch upon. The Master System, Sega's answer to Nintendo's 8-bit machine, didn't do all that well in Japan, but had an encouraging start in both Europe and the US, although not nearly enough to make a dent in the mid-80s Nintendo-domination. It wasn't until the sleek-looking Genesis/Mega Drive, a system that greatly outperformed the NES, that Sega started to make some serious headway on the console market. But it wasn't really until Sonic the Hedgehog sped into stores in 1991 where that headway started to become a credible lead. Sega has never recaptured the success of the Jenny Drive, selling almost 50 million units worldwide, with the Dreamcast unfortunately coming up the shortest in matching that number. Now, why is that? Well, Let's find out. The runaway success of the Blue Blur, along with some great arcade ports and sports titles, were squandered when, instead of letting the Genesis simply phase out and hype the upcoming Saturn, in late 1992 they decided to prop up the Genesis with its first add-on, rather than focusing on additional chips and new graphical techniques like Nintendo was exploring. Thus, the Sega CD was born, and everyone was asked the eternal question,
"Hey, you still don't have a Sega CD?"
No, I don't think I will.
The former head of Sega Europe, Mike Brogan, in an interview with Eurogamer, puts it simply: add-on devices don't increase market share. By their very nature, they sell into the existing customer base only. Sega's thought here was that the Genesis would continue to be their mainstream console for years to come, and wanted to sell additional add-ons for it, while the Sega Saturn would be their big elite sort of option that they would market to the hardcore. That was the initial thought, at least. Because that mainstream existing customer base wasn't all that into the Sega CD, funnily enough. It was a cheap, slow, consumer-grade CD drive that mostly resulted in grainy, gameplay-less FMV titles, while more traditional ones like, say, Mortal Kombat CD were barely improved upon over the Genesis versions. One of the few highlights was of course Sonic CD, but the price of the add-on, $299 at launch, limited the amount of people who could even play it. And finally, despite all those cost-saving measures, Sega still sold the CD unit at a loss, something the company did fairly regularly. But whatever, Sega can take a few hits. The Genesis and Sonic will carry them through. Now, since the Saturn was taking a while to come out in the US, which just so happened to be Sega's biggest market, they felt they needed another product in the meantime, since Genesis sales started to slow. This, of course, resulted in the legendary 32X, which was originally pitched to be its own standalone console, the Neptune, before Sega decided to make a very last-minute pivot. Since its only reason to exist was to kill time until the Saturn launch, it was decided that building another standalone console would just be too expensive for a stopgap system. Therefore, add-on! But why even really do this to begin with? Former Sega of America employee Scott Bayless was right on the front lines. The 32X was born in a call from Sega of Japan president Hayao Nakayama to Sega of America's R&D head Joe Miller. He was on a speakerphone, and there were several of us in Joe's suite at CES in Vegas. Mr. Nakayama basically said that we had to do something about Atari's forthcoming 64-bit Jaguar console. He was worried about it. Okay, let's take a minute here, breathe in, and read that last line again. We have to do something about the Atari Jaguar. So, when you are born of an idea as stupid as that, it's no surprise the 32X was an even bigger failure than the Sega CD, lasting only 6 months on the market, and aside from some competent ports like Virtua Fighter and Doom, it had very little to offer. Bayless again cuts to the core of Sega's problems around this time. Where it started to go sideways was in implementation. By the time it got to market, the 32X had been pared down significantly for cost reasons, but that reduction severely impaired its functionality, leaving it in a weird, uncompetitive space versus other devices that were looming on the horizon. I think the decision to respond to the Jaguar was symptomatic of that pervasive lack of direction that lay below the surface at Sega. Without a clear vision, we were just reacting. But Sega can take a few hits. The Saturn is coming out and Sonic will see them through, right? Unfortunately, due to all this, Sega lost a lot of goodwill from fans around this time, and because of all the impending competition, the Saturn was already put in a difficult position. Sega also miscalculated when designing the Saturn and thought sprite scaling was the future rather than full 3D, and thus built the Saturn around that philosophy. However, the competition had bet big on 3D for their respective machines, and when compared side by side with the Saturn, Sega's new console looked a little unimpressive. There was more than that though. The botched and hurried North American launch, the loss of several big third-party games, the lack of a mainline Sonic title, competition from Nintendo, and for a bevy of other reasons, the Saturn failed to achieve the same success as the Mega Genesis, not even shifting 10 million consoles worldwide, with a lifespan of roughly 4 years. Sega couldn't take any more hits like that. They needed to knock it out of the park with their next console, so they decided to make one more big play to place all their hopes and financial future on a dream. In 1997, Sega of Japan tasked 2 teams to make the Dreamcast architecture, then titled Project Katana, a so much cooler name, with both teams, who weren't even aware of each other, being on opposite ends of the world. One team focused on American technology and entered a contract with 3DFX to use their chipset as the base, while the Japanese team favored a Hitachi CPU architecture instead. Now, here's where things get interesting. Hey, here's that what happened you ordered! While many reasons can be cited as to why the Dreamcast ultimately failed to save the company, with most of them being pretty overt, the competition from the PS2, the fans they lost due to the add-ons, and Sonic's waning popularity, there's also many behind-the-scenes reasons that helped as well. 3DFX in the mid to late 90s was gaining traction for their chipsets, which powered awesome arcade hits like San Francisco Rush, Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey, and of course, Mace: The Dark Age.
The Executioner versus Mordo's Call.
Thus, the company went public, and when that happened, they let slip that they were providing chips for Sega's next machine, which wasn't even announced yet, prompting Sega to go... The Japanese office were furious with this leak and thus severed their contract with the chipmaker due to this injustice, despite the 3DFX architecture being the technically superior design. 3DFX, for their part, sued Sega for this breach of contract, and they eventually settled out of court. It's not publicly known how much Sega had to pay due to all this, but things are obviously getting rough for the Dreamcast, and the fucking thing wasn't even fully designed yet. Obviously, due to all these legal oopsies, Sega of Japan went with the Hitachi architecture in lieu of the more powerful 3DFX version. With the specs locked, Sega started courting various publishers to start making games for the cast of Dreams, but things unfortunately went sideways with one of their longtime partners. Say what you want about EA nowadays, believe me I do, but in the 90s they were well respected and supported the hell out of Sega's past consoles. However, Electronic Arts were also fans of 3DFX and had even invested in the company, so when they saw the Dreamcast specs, they were skeptical and ultimately passed on supporting the machine. According to EA exec Bing Gordon, if Sega had picked the direct competitor to 3DFX at the time, it would have been fine, but they picked someone we had never even heard of. It was somebody's friend of somebody's friend at a Japanese country club. It was a head scratcher, like, what are they doing? That was mostly it. Because of this now missing chunk in their gaming portfolio, sports titles were a must, Sega had to spend their own money to establish the 2K sports brand, and while this was certainly costly, the rise of a competitive alternative to EA is seen as a milestone within the gaming industry. While it, would have been easier for EA to have simply supported the system from the get-go, the long-standing effects of this decision are monumental. The rest of the Dreamcast core design and features were a classic example of ticking all the boxes. 4 controller ports to combat the N64, higher capacity discs to rival the PlayStation, internet connectivity, a cable at the bottom of the controller for some reason, and of course the crown jewel, the VMU. Also, whereas Sega's last few machines were lagging behind in the power department, the Dreamcast shined here in pretty much all regards, but the problem here was the timing. The console was designed to beat the PlayStation and the N64, and wasn't exactly concerned with the future, which always seemed to be a problem at Sega. It landed in the US, Sega's biggest market, on 9/9/99. Remember that? Yeah, well, all Sega fans remember that and make sure to bring it up every single September. all of Sega's hard work and money spending did result in one of the best launch lineups up until that point, and some would say of all time. Soul Calibur, Hydro Thunder, NFL 2K, Power Stone, House of the Dead 2, and yes, Sonic Adventure, the console's big marquee title. Even Sony was nervous enough about the launch that they purposely positioned the US version of Final Fantasy VIII to come out that exact same day. People were excited, and the sales at first were very brisk, with Sega touting it as the best console launch of all time. In terms of profit, over $130 million were made in the launch week alone. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, Sega had a habit of launching and selling things at a loss.
That's no good.
So it won't surprise some to know that Sega had spent far more than that launch week of profit just bringing the Dreamcast to market. They needed to sell even more games, and to sell them very quickly to start recouping costs. And within just a few short months, the Dreamcast's front-loaded library gave way to more and more arcade ports, which around this time were becoming less attractive to gamers. You can't build a varied library when a massive chunk of your titles were built around quick, quarter-munching experiences. You also need longer, more nuanced products as well. There were a few big gets and exclusives though, like Resident Evil CV, Quake 3, and Skies of Arcadia, but as good as those were, it just wasn't enough. Very, very quickly, Sega could see that the console was already flagging due to the low attach rate. Many people bought Sonic, but not much else. While the lack of variety in the library was a problem, there was also the fact that many people were simply waiting for the mighty PlayStation 2 to arrive, something Sega hadn't really planned on. To hopefully fix all this, they decided they needed something new, something immersive, a killer app that would turn heads and make people go, "Oh right, the Dreamcast!" That game was Yu Suzuki's Shenmue. Suzuki is often seen as Sega's Miyamoto, creating so many classic franchises for the company, it just boggles the mind. Virtua Fighter is obviously one of the most prolific, and speaking of which, that's what Shenmue began as, Virtua Fighter RPG for the Saturn, before it was moved to the Dreamcast and greatly expanded upon, and conversely was greatly splurged upon. Sega invested $50 million, and some have estimated far more, to produce Shenmue for the Dreamcast, the most expensive game of its day, and it really was the first of its kind, an example of what video games could be. A massive, sprawling, cinematic open-world game where the player could do pretty much anything they wanted, well, within certain restrictions of course.
Years ago, I was Chinese. Is that so?
Many aspects of modern video gaming owe a lot to the innovations and freedom Shenmue pioneered. But the last thing Sega should have been doing right then was spending more money they barely had. Despite it selling well when it hit stores in early November of 2000, Shenmue didn't really improve Dreamcast sales, nor did it increase the console's attach rate, and certainly didn't stop the record-setting launch of the PS2, which occurred only a few weeks before. The thunderous hype of Sony's console sequel, its graphical edge over the Dreamcast, and the support of publishers like Square and Electronic Arts is certainly viewed as the death nail in the death coffin of the death cast. What also didn't help was the Japanese economy, having plunged into recession in 2000, which forced Sega to really look at themselves and make some hard decisions. Now, something I did not know before researching for this video is that this was, for a little while, going to be the very real end of Sega, like in totality. On January 31st, 2001, Sega announced they were ceasing production of their current console, and a simultaneous roar of disapproval and regret from Sega kids was heard from the stratosphere. Along with this announcement, Sega also outlined their plans to focus on software, and that you'd see their games release on other machines within the next year. But things could have gone very differently because, unbeknownst to many, Sega was almost bankrupt.
What? No money?
The only reason the company still exists today is because of the generosity of just one man. The company that owned a majority stake in Sega was CSK Holdings, and chairman Asayo Okawa was the boss. people expected him to give the order for Sega to be shut down when the writing was clearly on the wall in 2000. But instead, he loaned Sega $500 million of his own money to pay off their outstanding debts, and going above and beyond, he then waived that loan on his deathbed 2 years later. When he did pass away due to cancer, he gifted Sega back his own personal shares, totaling $695 million, which is what made it possible for Sega to even turn into a publisher in the first place. You can't just go between being a hardware and then software company overnight. You need a lot of capital to make that transition, capital Sega didn't even have. With that huge cash injection though, we saw Sonic on Nintendo consoles, Shenmue 2 as an Xbox exclusive in the West, and Virtua Fighter on the PS2, which years before would have been seen as sheer heretical lunacy. Since then, Sega has had your proverbial dizzying highs, terrifying lows, and creamy middles, and overall seems to be doing okay now. I mean, hell, every September, stans say they swear a Dreamcast 2 is in the works, despite Sega insisting they are a software publisher first and foremost, further proving that the dream is indeed over. Whew, that was a crazy one. Thanks to C2 4U for nominating the subject of this episode. And if you're watching this right now and would like to put forward what you want to see on the next What Happened, either video game, movie, or other, head on over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon and make your voice known. See you next time, Sega kids, and thanks for watching. Well, it's now that time. With the Borderlands franchise frantically waving its arms in a manic panic at the game industry, desperately shrieking, "Don't forget about me, I'm still a thing!" we might as well pull the trigger on the pulse rifle and talk about one of the biggest gaming disasters in history. A story, nay, a legend that'll probably be taught in college seminars one day, or screw that, a million years from now when hot, hyper-intelligent visitors from beyond the stars reach our uninhabitable planet, they'll find cave paintings that crudely transcribe Kotaku and Polygon articles that paint a picture of the utter and total abject failure of Sega and Gearbox's first-person shooter, Aliens Colonial Marines. Let's rewind back to the somber, melancholy year of 2006. Sega is riding high on possible bankruptcy as their bid for third-party domination didn't quite pan out like they had envisioned. Just as a refresher, they committed the war crime that was Sonic 2006, finally gave us the Charlotte's Web game that we were clamoring for, and gambled on an expensive localization of the original Yakuza on the PS2 that unfortunately bombed in North America, which, by the way, also sealed the franchise's future of ever getting a Mark Hamill-voiced Majima ever again.
You're too kind.
Sega knew it needed to start pushing out something that might gain some traction in the West, so logically in December of that year, they announced they had acquired the Aliens franchise from 20th Century Fox for some reason. Sega felt the franchise was hot? Whatever the reason, they went all in on Xenomorphs. The original plan was to have 2 different games from 2 different developers, an RPG from Obsidian Entertainment, and a first-person shooter from the then up-and-coming studio, Gearbox Software. It's a pretty ambitious roadmap, but one that could certainly pay dividends. I mean, it's not like one of those games would be canceled and the other would take 7 years in development before releasing to a torrent of poor reviews, lawsuits, and leave a permanent stain on somebody's record. So what happened? So, yeah, let's just start with Gearbox. The house that Randy Pitchford built came from pretty humble beginnings, primarily working on console ports of PC games and PC ports of console games. Bam, boosh, bong. Their first original IP was the Brothers in Arms series, which came out just as World War II was getting hot and sexy in the world of video games. When Sega made the announcement of their bewildering deep dive into the Alien universe, they made one fatal flaw. Well, they made thousands in general, but this was the first. Neither of the games had started actual full-time development. Hell, pre-production wasn't even underway yet. Sega was just so dang proud of this big franchise acquisition that they made it public mere days after the deal was inked, which is something you usually wait on so you have something to, show.
Where the video games?
Regardless, it was slow going for Gearbox during this pre- and production phase because during the next 2 years, a lot of things happened. Mainly this, but also this. Gearbox was already busy developing the original Borderlands for 2K, but took the Aliens contract anyway, with the idea being once the looter-shooter game released, they'd swing into full-time development on Marines. This was also the first instance of Gearbox maybe mishandling the project a bit and maybe lying to Sega a bunch. A number of staff were reportedly pulled from Colonial Marines and moved over to finish up Borderlands, which Sega eventually caught wind of.
Damn.
The old saying goes, you can't bullshit a bullshitter. Now usually publishers, or not great publishers, feel that as long as you throw enough staff at a project that they're getting their money's worth. So, when Sega found out about this diverting of resources, they temporarily canceled the whole thing, as this was viewed as the final space nail in the space coffin. The license wasn't cheap, and Sega had already sunk a considerable amount of investment in it, but even at this early point, the future of the project was in question. While details regarding this specific time period are a bit murky, it seems that once Borderlands became a critical and commercial success, Sega wanted Gearbox back on the project as they suddenly became an in vogue developer. However, Randy Pitchford decided on a different business plan. 2K is of course a publisher with a lot more clout than Sega, and they wanted a Borderlands 2 immediately, and so did Gearbox. So they set to work to make sure to fill it with dialogue that would age like the finest wine.
You think it's racist or something?
But what about Colin Merriman? Well, this is where both Sega and Gearbox must have come to some type of understanding, because at this point, Sega was just settling with having the people behind Borderlands written on the box, even if it wasn't. Both parties decided that with everyone working on Borderlands 2, they'd just farm out the bulk of the work to another developer altogether, but with Gearbox overseeing the major design decisions. Enter Timegate Software. You may remember them from the unmemorable Section 8 games, or, maybe from designing the characters that appeared on PC graphics card boxes. 2009 also happened to be another bad year for Sega. Fancy that. Bam, boom, boof. The belt was getting tighter, and both Aliens games were costing them more and more money, so North American Sega suits felt they needed to permanently cancel one of them to save the other. The first-person shooter or the RPG? I don't know. Anyway, it wasn't a total wash because Obsidian was already close to finishing the underrated Alpha Protocol for Sega, so I don't think it hurt them in the long run. Now, Timegate Studios took control of full-time development in and around 2010, and were frankly shocked to see just how little Gearbox had to show for 4 years of work. There was apparently just a few character assets and some basic level geometry done, and all of it was still using the Borderlands shaders, which obviously couldn't be used. Timegate had to restart from scratch. What's more, since they were hired hands, both Gearbox and Sega would have final say over whatever they would produce, which, as you can imagine, was a slow and laborious process. One of the many other surprises waiting in store from Timegate, however, wasn't just limited to lack of in-game assets, but the storyline and narrative were also not finalized, which is kind of really very important if you're working on, a movie franchise. This was an aspect that Gearbox was originally supposed to be responsible for, and would be something that would constantly change again and again up until the last few months of development, and that's really obvious if you've played the final product. This would include the ludicrous idea of bringing back Michael Biehn, Corporal Hicks himself, into the story. Some space goobers grab him out of hypersleep and just force him to play a part in the DLC, and Dwayne's all like,
"Yeah? How'd that turn out? I hear it didn't go so well."
This is a sentiment shared by Kyle Reese himself, as he commented on his experience working on the project with Game Informer. Aliens Colonial Marines seem kind of passionless. I think in movies, television, and the gaming world, you get some people that are really, really passionate, and some people that are just going through the paces. They think that because they have a brand name, they're gonna get a hit game or a hit movie out of it. That certainly was the situation on Colonial Marines. This was in direct contrast with another role he played that same year, as Rex Colt in Far Cry Blood Dragon, a role which Bean relished and had nothing but good things to say about the team headed up by Dean Evans over at Ubisoft. Yeah, and enough of that. Let's get back into the shit, Marines.
All right, sweethearts, you heard the man and you know the drill. Hudson, come here. Come here.
Now, with all three companies now having a say, this was also when a creative clash started to flare up in regards to the style and focus of the game itself. Sega executives apparently wanted something more akin to Call of Duty, which of course was dominating the industry at the time. So they felt there should be far more human enemies for the player to engage with and to de-emphasize the xenomorphs. Both Gearbox and Timegate, for their part, objected to this, as they should, but it became a constant source of tension for the duration of the game's dev cycle. Not only that, but both developers had their own disagreements about workflow and priorities. Timegate was a company that felt like getting a game into a shippable state should have been their ultimate goal, where they would then work out the details and kinks later. Gearbox, however, seemed to second-guess every major decision and would constantly change things and reiterate what they had at every opportunity. Compounding matters was the fact that they were busy with their own projects like Borderlands 2 and Duke Nukem Forever. Yes, during all this, Gearbox was also trying to ship another troubled first-person shooter at the same time, so it's safe to say that most of their concerns were elsewhere. This would bring us to E3 2012, where Gearbox would present the very good-looking and the very lie-filled demo that they show members of the press. Now, they did have a demo back at E3 2011 as well, but that was admittedly a pretty early build and looked the part. However, what happened in 2012 is a little bit more nuanced than you might expect. It's common practice for publishers to show off demos that are not running on actual hardware, but rather high-powered workstations that present the game at the highest graphical fidelity and feature gameplay and systems that are, in flux. Anthem's E3 demo is a good example of this. But now, since we're talking about the Xbox 360 and the PS3, there was a limit on how far they could push the systems, but for this E3 demo, Timegate was apparently instructed by Gearbox to not worry about the performance, just make it awesome, and to jack the game up to 11, fully knowing that the console hardware would not be able to replicate this experience. This was exclusively for demo purposes, and even the PC version of the game would never live up to this presentation. They needed to impress during this E3 showing, even if it meant putting on a bit more razzle-dazzle than needed. Once E3 was over, they then went back to paring everything down to meet console and middle-of-the-road PC specs. Yep, back to business. Another problem here, however, is that unlike most publishers, Randy Pitchford constantly touted this demo as real gameplay and made no attempt to clarify that this was merely a target goal for the game's visuals and that the final release version might wind up looking a little bit different. Oops. It was also around this time, mid-2012, where Gearbox was finally winding down on development of their real game, Borderlands 2. They then grabbed the reins of development from Timegate, and things finally got back on track, except they didn't. Gearbox started to redo almost everything in the game, stripping it down and rebuilding it back up in the way that they wanted. This was reportedly done for two reasons. One, eternally, the builds Timegate had produced were considered lackluster by Gearbox or Sega or both. And two, Timegate never even got it running on the PS3 at all, so yeah, there was shit to do. Remember, at this point, Colonial Marines have been in development for 6 years, and Gearbox were shitting themselves at the idea of asking Sega for more time, so let's say hello to a good friend of ours here at What Happened, Mr. Crunch! What followed was 9 months of all hands on deck, as everyone just wanted this thing done and gone. So, if it seems like Aliens Colonial Marines was slapped together in a rushed, sloppy mad dash towards a finish line, there's a good reason for that. It's because it was slapped together in a rushed, sloppy mad dash towards. Now, while not exactly confirmed, there were some employees from both Timegate and Gearbox who had heard rumblings of Sega potentially resorting to litigation for breach of contract if the game wasn't out by the end of their fiscal year, which ended in March. Hence why it squeaked just under the wire in mid-February. So, when it finally launched for the Xbox 360, PC, and miraculously, the PlayStation 3 after 7 years, people started to notice some slight differences between the E3 version and the final version, since, most people have eyes. Not only were there some stark visual differences, fans also found the game fairly broken from a variety of standpoints, from AI to audio, as well as tons of glitches. They were everywhere.
Is this gonna be a stand-up fight, sir, or another bug hunt?
While Aliens was not exactly the hottest franchise at the time, the legacy of the first two films led to hardcore fans analyzing the product a bit more closely than if this was, say, called UFOs, Provincial Soldiers, and was published by Maximum Games or whatever. So taking a microscope to it and comparing footage then resulted in a class action lawsuit against both Sega and Gearbox for misrepresenting the product during E3 and selling something very different at launch.
This installation has a substantial dollar value attached to it.
They can bill me.
It was initially filed by two gamers in California who specifically cited Randy Pitchford for introducing the demo as actual gameplay.
And so you're going to see what the game actually looks like, not just screenshots, but the actual gameplay.
If you ever wonder why trailers and such say things like pre-alpha footage or not final gameplay, this is why. The lawsuit languished for 2 years until 2015, where Sega finally offered a $1.2 million settlement to try and make all of this just go away. In response, the plaintiff's lawyers agreed to drop Gearbox from the suit. Wait, what? I guess Randy was taking notes from Alien director Ridley Scott's scot-free productions, because he certainly got off that way. Gearbox's unwillingness to pay any money towards the suit and their hearty throwing of Sega under the bus is cited as to why this decision came to be, as Sega was seen as a much more viable target. For their part, Gearbox maintained that they sunk $10 to $50 million of their own money into the development of the game, which Sega was to pay back, which they never made good on.
We're on express elevator to hell, going down.
Sega then refuted this, saying that the millions of dollars that they had paid up front to Gearbox, leading into developmental milestones, were mishandled and instead used to finish their other projects. This was then considered by Sega a breach of their contract and negated the money Gearbox had spent. All this legalese aside, it's pretty clear from just about every angle that Gearbox felt Colonial Marines wasn't worth their full attention and effort, and they prioritized the games they had a bigger stake in, like Borderlands and Duke Nukem Forever, the latter being an IP they now fully own. Gearbox also distanced themselves from the suit as they claimed it was Sega who had final approval on all things related to marketing, and that they were just merely a contractor. Sega then fired back, saying that Gearbox were just as culpable and that they would overstep their boundaries in regards to the game's promotional strategies, often leaking details and screenshots and panels and interviews without Sega's approval. Sega USA exec Matt Iyer said in a company email within Sega, "I spoke face-to-face to Gearbox's Steve Gibson about their persistent panel leaking. Effectively, it's Randy Pitchford doing whatever the he likes. Apparently, he did it twice on Borderlands 2 against all plans and despite the fact they asked him not to. I think our best result here is that we should stop having any more panel sessions." Oh, Randy. This crazy APC doesn't stop here though. Look, if it wasn't abundantly clear, Colonial Marines wasn't something anyone thought highly of during development, evidenced by one tiny little letter, one wayward little A. 4 years after the game's launch, a modder discovered just how shoddily coded the game really was. pecangame.pecansec_act_attach pawn to teether. This one bit of text is something that controlled pretty much all the Xeno behavior in the game. Now, for those wondering, No, the programmer wasn't just hankering for a hearty snack. Pecan was actually a code name for Colonial Marines, and yes, teether is not really a word. It's supposed to read tether, which would actually anchor the Xeno to the playable area. It would then dictate where they would patrol, let them know where all the available exits and spawn points were. It was the backbone of their AI. This tiny misspelling resulted in many pics and memes that showed the Xenos wandering aimlessly in the game and generally ignoring the player. This is also the perfect dilution of the project, a sloppy bit of oversight that could have been easily remedied if not for the constant mismanagement and general disdain all parties seemingly had for it. How this was never caught during testing, where one day the AI is fine and then suddenly the perfect organism it's banging its head against every wall in LV-426, we'll never know. Now, through all the fire and the acidic blood, amid controversies, lawsuits, and a critical drubbing, the game actually sold well over 1 million copies for Sega in a month, which was at least encouraging enough for them to push forward the franchise and release Creative Assembly's Alien Isolation. This was a much more polished game that Creative Assembly seemed to take great pride in making, paid proper homage to the film that inspired it, and stands as one, if not the best Alien game ever made. So, where are they all now? Well, in a complete turnaround from 2006, Sega has now found success in the West with Yakuza, but seems to no longer have the rights to the Alien franchise, since Fox is now releasing Alien Blackout for mobile, which has been really well received by fans so far. Gearbox was met with complete failure shortly after the release of Marines with Battleborn in 2015, and then languished for a number of years, getting rid of awesome ports of Duke Nukem 3D and replacing them with their own inferior ports. That is, until just a few weeks ago, where they announced a glut of Borderlands games and re-releases. And of course, Randy Pitchford's found himself in a spot of bother, which I'm sure he'd like to simply vanish, much like Timegate Studios. Unfortunately, shortly after the release of Aliens, the small Texas-based company closed their doors in 2013. It's all a bit sad, as while everyone is to blame for everything here, Timegate was simply a middleman contracted to finish a disastrous product, but wound up being the only one getting chest-bursted. So if you know of any other infected gaming planets overrun with controversies, let me know in the comments below, or check out the Flophouse VIP Patreon to officially vote on our next subject so we can hopefully nuke it from orbit, because
it's the only way to be sure.